You find yourself standing in the soft haze of ancient Rome, not the bustling and dramatic Rome usually summoned in memory, but a quieter version of it, where smoke from slow-burning hearths drifts upward in pale ribbons, and the steady rhythm of day-to-day life settles over the city like a warm blanket. In this gentler landscape, where streets hum with soft conversation rather than shouts, where carts roll by at patient speeds, there exists a small community of women whose lives shaped the stability of the entire Roman world. These women were known as the Vestal Virgins. They were the guardians of a flame that was believed to protect the city itself, a flame that could never be allowed to die. Their story is not often told in full. Many remember the surface facts. Young girls chosen to serve the goddess Vesta, a sacred fire, a 30-year commitment. Yet beneath these points lies a long and intricate pattern of daily tasks, obligations, and private experiences that reveal a surprisingly grounded history. Their work was slow, repetitive, and unglamorous, shaped less by the drama of the empire and more by the quiet discipline required to maintain order in a world that depended on ritual and tradition. As you listen, imagine the faint crackle of an ancient fire echoing through a marble chamber, providing a soft and steady presence as the rest of Rome ebbs and flows around it. The Vestal Virgins were selected as children, often around the age of 6 or 7, at a time when they had barely begun to understand the shape of their own lives. The selection process itself held great weight. Families considered it both an honor and a burden. A daughter who became a Vestal gained prestige for her household. Yet she also stepped out of the normal rhythms of Roman family life. She would no longer belong to her father's household, nor would she later marry and raise children. Instead, she entered a new world inside the house of the Vestals, where silence, ritual, and service defined her upbringing. You can picture the moment a child entered this place for the first time, perhaps clutching the hand of a parent or standing alone with curiosity and fear, mixing quietly in her chest. The building was situated near the Roman Forum, close to the center of civic life. Its structure included living chambers, storage rooms, and the famous circular temple where the sacred fire burned. Daily routines followed carefully prescribed rituals rather than personal preference. To serve Vesta meant to surrender personal choice, replacing it with ritual precision. The central flame was the heart of their duty. It was believed that as long as the fire remained alive, Rome itself would be protected. If it ever went out, it foreshadowed disaster. For that reason, tending the flame became an unending task. A Vestal would rise before dawn to check its strength, feeding it with selected wood while reciting quiet prayers. The air would often be cool, and the fire provided both warmth and light, though neither was its primary purpose. Its value lay in symbolism. Rome's fate rested in its glow. Beyond the flame, the Vestals had other tasks that rarely receive attention today. They prepared sacred materials used in many Roman state rituals. They created a special mixture known as mola salsa, a combination of salt and flour used in public sacrifices. Preparing it required slow grinding, careful mixing, and steady patience. Much of their time was spent working with their hands in silence, their minds drifting through thoughts that never made it into the written record. One can imagine long afternoons in shaded rooms, where only the faint sound of pestles grinding against stone filled the air. Another responsibility involved safeguarding important state documents and objects. Wills of prominent Romans were entrusted to them, locked away in their storage chambers. Treaties, state contracts, and various relics found shelter under their watch. In this way, the Vestals functioned almost like an early form of archive keepers or custodians of state memory. Few recognize how essential this duty was. A mismanaged document could disrupt political order or weaken alliances. Their reliability ensured continuity in a society built on tradition and precedent. Despite their religious role, the Vestals held unusual freedoms compared to other Roman women. They could own property, manage wealth, and even free prisoners in the street simply by touching them. Their presence carried an aura of legal authority, born from centuries of tradition that granted them this respect. Yet their freedom existed alongside strict expectations. Their vow of chastity lasted 30 continuous years, divided into 3 periods of training, service, and teaching. Breaking this vow was seen as an offense not only against Vesta but against the entire state. The punishment was severe. Yet rather than focus on the dramatic stories sometimes told about these rare incidents, consider instead the calm endurance required to live an entire adult life devoted to ritual purity and service. Daily life for a Vestal was shaped by routine. She woke early, tended to her tasks, studied ritual rules, and observed the subtle rhythms of the temple. Festivals disrupted this quiet pattern, but also required greater effort. During the festival of Vesta, the temple doors would open to the public, and the entire city participated in rituals involving food, offerings, and purification. At such times, the Vestals often stood at the center of slow-moving crowds, overseeing ceremonies that reinforced the connection between household hearths and the sacred flame. It was believed that Vesta protected not only the city, but every home within it, making the role of the Vestals intimately tied to daily domestic life across Rome. You might imagine a young Vestal carrying a small basket of offerings through the shaded interior of the temple, her sandals soft against the stone, her mind focused on each step of a ritual she had practiced countless times. Her world was one of patterns, cycles, and constant repetition. Far from the battlefield or senate, she upheld Rome's stability in a quiet and often overlooked way. The House of the Vestals itself was an environment unlike any other in the city. Its courtyard featured statues of former chief Vestals, each representing a woman who had completed her long term of service. These statues stood as constant reminders of duty fulfilled. Younger Vestals walked among them daily, absorbing a sense of continuity and heritage. The architecture of the space shielded them from the noise of the forum, creating a small insulated world where time seemed to move at a gentler pace. One of the most interesting aspects of their role is how ordinary it sometimes felt. While history often emphasizes the sacredness of their tasks, we should not forget that these tasks still required the mundane labor of daily upkeep. Wood needed to be gathered, ash needed to be swept, ritual tools needed cleaning. The fire had to be watched during long nights when fatigue settled in. This blend of sacred symbolism and practical maintenance created a type of life rarely explored in popular accounts of ancient Rome. There were also long periods of quiet study. Vestals memorized rituals, chants, and rules regarding sacrifice and purification. They learned about Roman religious law, which guided the relationship between the state and the gods. In many ways, they became walking repositories of ritual knowledge. If a mistake occurred during a public ceremony, the consequences could be severe, as Romans believed that even a small oversight could anger the gods. Thus, a Vestal's memory carried immense responsibility. Beyond the temple, their presence played a symbolic role in the civic imagination of Rome. When important oaths were taken, or treaties formed, people believed that the stability of these agreements was strengthened by the purity and constancy represented by the Vestals. Their continued service through centuries of political change created a sense of unbroken continuity linking early Rome to its later empire. When you picture ancient Rome at night, you might imagine the flickering light of household hearths scattered across the city. Yet within the Temple of Vesta, the fire continued burning, watched by women who had sworn to keep it alive at every moment. Their lives unfolded quietly, often unnoticed by the broader public. Yet the people lived with a steady belief that as long as the flame remained unbroken, Rome itself would endure. With all these details, one begins to see how the Vestal virgins were both ordinary and extraordinary at once. Their daily work required patience more than spectacle, discipline more than drama. They served not through heroic actions but through uninterrupted constancy. They shaped Rome by shaping its rituals, its documents, its symbols, and its sense of continuity. Yet, this is only the beginning of their story. There remains much to explore about their personal lives, their social position, the challenges they faced, and the ways their role evolved across centuries of Roman history. And there is the deeper question still lingering in the background. What did it feel like to live inside such a strict structure from childhood to adulthood, performing the same tasks year after year, with the fate of the city said to rest on your steady hands? You continue your slow walk through the ancient grounds of the House of the Vestals, the early morning light settling across pale marble, as gently as dust on an unused scroll. The city around you has already begun its daily rhythms, though you hear only faint echoes of it here. A distant wagon creaks across uneven stones. A vendor calls softly, advertising warm bread. Yet within the borders of this sacred space, the air feels suspended, as if you have stepped slightly outside the ordinary motion of Rome. In Section 1, you explored the basic structure of a Vestal's life, the ongoing rituals, the quiet responsibilities, and the symbolic significance that rested on their shoulders. But the details of their daily existence go far deeper, shaped by the subtle interactions, rare privileges, and occasional burdens that defined their unusual position in Roman society. To understand them more fully, you must look at how they moved through the world, how they learned, how they served, and how Rome in turn regarded them. The 30-year term of service for a Vestal virgin unfolds in 3 distinct phases. each marked by a gradual shift in responsibility. The first 10 years were dedicated to learning. A new Vestal entered the house as a child, often still small enough that the world seemed impossibly large. Her early training focused on absorbing the rituals associated with Vesta's fire, memorizing chants, understanding the processes behind making sacred mixtures, and learning the subtle gestures required for ceremonies. At this age, much of her time was spent under the watchful guidance of senior Vestals, who had long since internalized the pattern of each day. These older women served as instructors, role models, and protectors in a way. They helped shape the child into a competent guardian of the flame. Imagine a quiet afternoon in one of the shaded rooms, where an older Vestal sits beside a young novice, explaining the proper way to handle a ritual tool. She guides the child's small hands with patient steadiness, repeating the steps again and again, not because the task is complex, but because repetition fosters the precision required for sacred work. These lessons were not rushed. Time did not govern them. The rhythm of learning unfolded with the slow patience that defined the entire institution. The second 10-year period, known as the years of service, marked a shift from learning to doing. Now the young woman took direct responsibility for tending the sacred fire and participating in ceremonies. She would rise earlier, work longer hours, and serve alongside other fully trained Vestals. It is during these years that the weight of expectation pressed most heavily on her. A mistake made during ritual was believed to have consequences for the city. Even a lapse in attention could disturb the delicate balance between the divine and the civic. Yet the pressure remained silent rather than dramatic. A Vestal lived with a constant reminder of duty, not through harsh scolding or fear, but through the steady awareness that her actions held significance beyond her own life. Picture a Vestal standing before the flame, her face flickering softly with reflected light. She breathes slowly, checks the embers, adds wood in the correct manner, and takes a moment to listen to the quiet crackle. No crowd is watching, no officials stand nearby, yet she performs her duty with the same care she would show during a major ceremony. This is the quiet strength that defined her role. The final 10-year period transformed her into a teacher. Now she guided younger Vestals, offering the same patience and consistency she had once received. This stage served as a bridge between service and release, allowing her to transition from ritual life into something more independent. After 30 years, she was free to leave the House of the Vestals entirely, though not everyone chose to go. Many remained out of personal preference, finding comfort in the structure that had defined their entire adult life. Outside of these phases, one of the most intriguing elements of Vestal life lies in the way they moved through the city. While most Roman women lived under specific restrictions, a Vestal enjoyed freedoms reserved for the few. She could walk through the streets without a male guardian, travel across the city at her own pace, or ride in a carriage. When a Vestal appeared in public, people made room for her. This was not due to fear, but to respect. Her presence signified purity, stability, and the continuity of Rome's traditions. She also held legal privileges. A Vestal could give testimony without an oath, something no other Roman woman could do. Her word, by tradition, was considered pure. She could free a condemned prisoner simply by touching him as she passed, a belief rooted in the idea that her purity carried divine protection. This extraordinary power gave her a rare position in public life, though she used it seldom, as the Vestal order emphasized restraint and discretion. Her clothing distinguished her further. Vestals wore simple but symbolic garments. Their hair was arranged in a style called the infulla, wrapped with white woolen bands that flowed down the back. Their robes were modest, designed more for ritual propriety than decoration. When you imagine a Vestal walking through a Roman street, picture a figure dressed entirely in pale tones, moving quietly among the bustling crowd, a living reminder of the city's sacred foundations. Yet their lives were not without challenges. The vow of chastity remains the most frequently discussed aspect of their service, though the details surrounding it are often misunderstood. Romans believed that the chastity of the Vestals protected the purity of the sacred fire. If they broke this vow, it was thought to threaten the safety of Rome. The consequences for such a breach were severe. A Vestal could be buried alive in a small underground chamber, not as a direct act of violence but as a ritual requirement. Since no Roman was permitted to spill the blood of a Vestal, these events were extremely rare and surrounded by complex legal procedures. Still, the possibility hung silently over the order, shaping the social expectations placed upon them. Yet focusing only on this dramatic element would overlook the more subtle pressures they faced daily. They lived within close boundaries of behavior, always observed, always expected to maintain composure. Their home was large, but it was also confining. They interacted with the outside world but remained somewhat apart from it. They were surrounded by privilege, yet they lived under constant scrutiny. It is this mixture of honor and constraint that defines their unique place in Roman society. Another important element of their role involved the guardianship of sacred objects. Romans entrusted certain relics to the Vestals, believing their protection required ritual purity. Among these relics was the Palladium, a small, ancient statue said to protect Rome. Whether the actual relic resembled the descriptions given in later centuries is uncertain, but its symbolic power was immense. The Vestals kept it in a secure chamber, away from public view, ensuring its safety as part of their broader duty. Their involvement in the preservation of legal and political documents also shaped their significance. Wills of important figures rested in their care, including the wills of generals, politicians, and even emperors. These documents contained instructions that could affect the future of Rome, determining inheritances, political transitions, and property rights. Because the Vestals were seen as impartial and trustworthy, their house became a natural repository for such important papers. One might imagine a Vestal entering a storage chamber with a small oil lamp in hand, checking the shelves where scrolls were arranged. She would ensure that each document was stored correctly, that no moisture reached the parchment, and that the seals remained intact. Her handling of these materials required the same patience and steadiness that defined all her tasks. Through such small, careful actions, she shaped the way Rome governed itself. The House of the Vestals, where all of this took place, functioned as both a home and a sacred complex. It included 30 or more rooms, courtyards, workspaces, storage chambers, and living quarters. A visitor walking through it would notice its unusual quietness. The thick walls softened the sound of the forum, creating a sense of separation that allowed the Vestals to focus on their duties. Gardens with small fountains offered moments of calm reflection. Statues of retired Vestals lined the main courtyard, each holding a symbolic gesture or object, reminding the current residents of the generations of women who had tended the fire before them. Meals were simple. Much of the food prepared for the Vestals followed ritual guidelines, particularly during festivals or certain seasons of the religious calendar. They ate bread, fruits, vegetables, and occasionally fish or meat when appropriate for ceremony. Their dining spaces were plain and functional, emphasizing community and discipline rather than comfort. Their days were predictable, though not without variety. Some mornings began with ritual cleansing, others began with preparation of sacred mixtures. During certain months, festivals required them to assist in large public ceremonies. Special days devoted to Vesta drew crowds who approached the temple, seeking blessings for their household hearths. These periods broke the usual quiet patterns of the Vestals' routine, adding layers of responsibility and subtle tension as they ensured each ritual was performed with accuracy. Even in the calmest periods, the work never fully stopped. The fire required constant supervision. Ritual items needed cleaning. Instruction for younger Vestals continued. The responsibilities stretched across the entire year, binding their lives to the slow cycles of Roman religion. All of these details paint a fuller picture of the Vestal virgins, one that extends far beyond the simple notion of guardians of a flame. They were archivists, ritual specialists, legal witnesses, moral symbols, and caretakers of Rome's spiritual identity. Their world blended the sacred and the ordinary in a way that makes their history both simple and profound. Yet one question still lingers. For all the structure and significance surrounding their lives, how did these women truly feel as they carried out their duties year after year, walking the same halls, repeating the same rituals, and maintaining a flame that symbolized the fate of an entire city? As you return once more to the quiet pathways of the House of the Vestals, a gentle sense of closure begins to settle in the air, though not an abrupt one. The life of a Vestal virgin unfolded slowly, shaped by repetitions and long-held rituals, and so the story of their world, too, arrives at its conclusion in measured steps. The soft echo of sandals on stone, the faint warmth of the ever-burning flame, and the steady hum of a city living according to ancient tradition continue to form the background as you move deeper into the final reflections of their history. In the first two sections, you explored the daily rhythms, responsibilities, and social place of the Vestals. You saw the calm routines of their mornings, the weight of their vows, the quiet spaces they inhabited, and the symbolic presence they carried in Roman society. In this final section, the focus turns toward the broader arc of their existence across time, the long centuries over which they served, the changes that shaped their role, and the slow fading of their presence as Rome shifted from a deeply ritualized society to a new world shaped by different beliefs. To understand the transformation of the Vestal Order, imagine Rome not as a fixed image, but as a living organism, changing gradually through the generations. The Rome of the early Republic, when the Vestal tradition first rose to prominence, was a small, tightly knit community. Rituals were simple and closely connected to domestic life. The Temple of Vesta, with its circular structure and constant flame, resembled a communal hearth more than a grand monument. In these early years, the Vestals embodied the idea that the city itself was a kind of extended household, bound together by shared customs rather than imperial ambition. As the Republic grew, however, Rome expanded its political and military reach. New territories, new citizens, and new ideas entered the city. Yet the Vestals' role remained remarkably stable amid all this change. Their presence became a symbol of continuity, anchoring Rome's identity even as the world around it shifted. During times of crisis, Romans looked toward the temple to reassure themselves that the flame still burned, that the city remained spiritually protected. You can picture a moment during a time of political turmoil, perhaps during a period of conflict between rival leaders. Outside the temple, the forum might be filled with anxious voices, debates, and urgent movement. But inside the house of the Vestals, the routines continued with their patient rhythm. A Vestal checked the fire, another prepared ritual materials. A younger girl practiced chants under the guidance of a teacher. Their work stayed the same even when the city trembled. It is this steadiness, this unbroken thread of tradition, that made them so significant. Their role, however, also placed them in an unusual position during periods of political upheaval. Because the Vestals safeguarded important documents, they sometimes found themselves indirectly drawn into conflicts. Wills stored within their chambers could determine political outcomes. Treaties entrusted to them could define alliances. A Vestal did not participate in these affairs directly, but her guardianship of these materials played a silent part in Rome's political landscape. One of the most widely remembered moments involving the Vestals occurred during the late Republic. As civil conflicts intensified, political figures understood that public trust in their intentions rested partly on the documents held by the Vestals. When Julius Caesar filed his will with them, it symbolized stability and legitimacy. When others followed the same tradition, they acknowledged the unique authority and neutrality embodied by the Vestal Order. This quiet influence stretched far beyond ritual. It shaped decisions affecting the fate of the empire. Yet, despite these occasional glimpses into public affairs, the Vestals themselves remained removed from politics by design. Their world remained centered on the temple, the flame, and the steady flow of ritual duties. The broader turmoil of Roman history swept past them, but did not fundamentally alter their internal routines. One of the more overlooked aspects of their experience involves the psychological structure of their lives. From childhood, a Vestal entered a setting defined not by personal ambition or family expectations, but by ritual demands. Choices were few, many days repeated the same patterns. She learned to calm her mind, maintain composure, and find meaning in the constancy of her tasks. This pattern may have shaped her inner world in a profound way, teaching her patience, focus, and discipline unlike any other group in Rome. But the order also presented challenges, and not all Vestals adapted to its structure in the same way. The long separation from one's family, the absence of typical social bonds, and the expectation of absolute self-restraint created emotional pressures that rarely appear in surviving written records. The sources that remain often depict the Vestals as symbols rather than individuals, leaving their personal experiences largely unspoken. And yet, if you walk the quiet steps of their daily routine in your imagination, you can sense the complex feelings that might have lived beneath the surface. Consider the moment when a Vestal completed her 30 years of service. For 3 decades, she had risen each day within the same walls, walked the same paths, tended the same fire, and lived within an environment shaped entirely by ritual. Now she stepped out into a world she had rarely experienced fully. Some chose to remain within the order, not ready to leave the structure that had become familiar. Others returned to their families, or began lives of independence. Records say that a former Vestal could marry if she wished, though many did not. It is said that potential husbands sometimes feared marrying a woman who had lived so long within sacred boundaries. Yet it is equally likely that many former Vestals simply preferred to remain within the calm rhythm they had grown used to. Still, the possibility of leaving it all was unusual in Roman religious life. Most priesthoods were lifelong positions, The Vestal Order alone offered a complete cycle of training, service, teaching, and release. This structure made their experience unique, not just within Rome, but across many ancient cultures. They lived almost as figures outside time, stepping away from ordinary life in childhood, and returning only when they had become fully mature. As Rome entered the imperial period, the Vestals maintained their position at the heart of the city. Emperors often honored them, attending ceremonies or granting them special privileges. Their presence at public events reminded citizens of Rome's ancient roots, the traditions that predated the empire itself. The continuity of the flame became a powerful symbol in an age when rulers rose and fell with increasing speed. But as centuries passed, Rome changed yet again. New religions spread across the empire, and new ideas began to challenge the old structures. The rise of Christianity in particular reshaped the city's spiritual landscape. Temples that once formed the core of Roman life saw fewer visitors. Rituals lost some of their significance. Gradually, the ancient traditions that had defined the Vestal Order began to fade. One of the turning points came in the early 4th century, when imperial support for the old religion weakened. Funding for temples declined. Ritual positions once considered essential were no longer maintained with the same care. Yet the Vestals continued their work for a time, tending the flame even as the world around them shifted. Their persistence in the face of uncertainty reveals how deeply rooted their traditions were, and how powerful the sense of duty remained among the final women who served. Eventually, however, the end of the Vestal Order arrived. The sacred flame, which had burned for centuries, was extinguished under the direction of a Christian emperor. The temple was closed, and the remaining Vestals were released from their duties. Their disappearance marked the end of one of the longest-lived religious institutions in the ancient world. When you imagine the moment the flame went out, do not picture a dramatic scene filled with ceremony or grand farewell. More likely, it was simple and quiet. The fire had been tended for longer than anyone could remember, passed from one generation of women to the next across countless seasons. Its final moments would have been marked by the soft dimming of embers, the gentle settling of ashes, and a stillness that lingered among the stones of the temple. The disappearance of the Vestals raises a deeper question about the nature of tradition. What happens when a society places immense meaning in a symbol for centuries, only to allow it to vanish in a single generation? The answer lies in how Rome itself evolved. The city did not collapse when the flame went out. Its political structures changed, its spiritual identity shifted, but the memory of the Vestals survived, reminding later generations that even the quietest traditions can shape the fate of a civilization. Their legacy continues not through rituals or relics, but through the way they represented the connection between stability and care. They showed that the strength of a community can depend on the steady, uncelebrated work of those who protect its values quietly and patiently. Their story invites reflection on how societies preserve their identity, not through dramatic events, but through daily acts performed with consistency and devotion. As you step away from the imagined grounds of the House of the Vestals, the memory of their world lingers. You may picture the gentle glow of the sacred flame, the sound of soft footsteps across marble, or the quiet concentration of a young girl learning a ritual she would repeat for decades. And perhaps you find yourself considering a question that remains unresolved. What does it tell us about a civilization when its most enduring guardians are those whose labor is almost entirely unseen? That question marks the close of this story, and also invites new reflections as we continue to explore more hidden corners of history. The valley, known as Silent Hollow, sat in a fold between two long rolling hills, where the mist lingered longer than it did anywhere else in the region. Travelers said the fog there behaved differently. It curled low across the ground as if listening to the earth rather than floating above it. Locals believed that the valley was old beyond memory, a place where forgotten stories still drifted through the grasses, waiting to be heard by anyone patient enough to stop and listen. Yet most people hurried through it, eager to reach safer ground, leaving its tales untouched. Only those who lived in the hollow understood its quiet ways, and no one understood them more than the old carpenter, Rogan of the Hollow. Rogan lived in a crooked timber cottage at the valley's center, where a thin stream wandered by his doorstep. The cottage leaned slightly to one side, but every beam in it fit as if carved deliberately to settle into its gentle slant. Rogan was a man shaped by the land the same way wood was shaped under his hands. He had shoulders made broad from decades of lifting oak planks, but his eyes held a softness that made people trust him without knowing why. He spoke rarely, and listened often. To him, every tree held a story, and every piece of wood deserved respect for the life it had once lived. People from villages scattered over the hills sought him out when they needed something more than ordinary. Rogan did not craft chairs simply to be sat upon, nor doors merely to be opened and closed. When he carved the memories of the valley into the grain. A cradle from his hands would rock as gently as river water. A table would feel warm even in the coldest months. And if he made a walking staff, it would balance in the user's hand as if it were alive with purpose. Yet Rogan himself lived simply, keeping few possessions. His workshop always smelled of fresh shavings and warm resin. The floor was swept clean at sunrise each morning. The tools on his wall hung in careful order, each with its own place, each polished by years of steady work. His life moved by the rhythm of seasons, and in those quiet patterns he found peace. But one autumn, something shifted. The air felt heavier than usual, and a stillness settled across the hollow, as if the valley were holding its breath. Birds flew overhead but avoided flying low through the mist. Even the stream beside Rogan's cottage slowed to a sluggish crawl, whispering instead of singing against the stones. Rogan noticed, though he said nothing at first. He waited, as he always did, for the land to reveal the meaning of its silence. The answer came with a visitor. One windless morning, as the mist wrapped itself in thick folds around the hollow, a knock sounded at Rogan's door. The sound was firm but trembled slightly, as if the one knocking wished to appear brave but could not quite manage it. When Rogan opened the door, a young woman stood outside, her cloak damp from the fog. She held the reins of a tired mule, and her eyes were dark with worry. "Are you Rogan, the carpenter the valley speaks of?" she asked. "I am," he said in his slow, gentle way. "What brings you through the hollow on a morning like this?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder into the mist. "I was told you craft more than wood, that you shape meaning into your work, that sometimes you listen differently than other men." Rogan considered her words. "The hollow speaks to those who hear it. What do you need from me?" The woman introduced herself as Elara. She was from a village far across the northern ridge, a journey of several days. Rogan offered her a place by the hearth and a warm drink. As she settled in, her voice steadied enough to share her story. Her village, she said, had been plagued by a strange misfortune. Tools snapped for no reason. Doors would not stay shut, even when latched. Wagons broke on clear, well-traveled paths. At first people dismissed it as bad luck, but then the houses began to creak at night with unnatural sounds, and beams that had stood firm for generations suddenly split down the center. It was as if the wood itself had become restless. "We called carpenters from everywhere," Elara said. "They replaced planks, mended frames, reinforced walls, yet the more they repaired, the worse everything grew. My father believes it is a curse. Others think the woods to the north hold something that has awakened." Rogan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked softly, "What have you come seeking?" "A remedy," she whispered. "A way to quiet whatever is unsettling our homes. They told me you understand the oldest ways, the ways that were known before the villages were built." Rogan's gaze lowered to the cup in his hands. He felt a pull, faint but unmistakable, like a distant hum traveling through the earth. He had sensed the valley's unrest for weeks. Now he understood that the disturbance reached farther than Silent Hollow. "Elara," he said, "what you speak of is not a simple matter of repairing timber. Wood remembers. It holds the breath of the forest from which it came. If something is stirring within it, then it must be heard." She nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her expression. "Will you help us?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he stood and crossed the room to the shelf where he kept his oldest tools. From the highest corner he lifted a small wooden box carved with a pattern of spiraling lines. It was a design older than any craft he used in his daily work. The box had been given to him long ago by the previous keeper of the hollow, a woman who taught him that wood was never merely a material, it was an echo of the living world. Rogan set the box on the table and opened it with deliberate care. Inside lay a slender tool shaped like a chisel, but carved from pale ash wood, smooth and warm as if it held a quiet fire within. Rogan had not touched it in many years. "This," he said, "is meant for listening." Elara watched with wide eyes. "Listening to what?" "To whatever calls," he said simply. Rogan closed the box again, then looked toward the mist outside his window. The hollow seemed to lean closer, as if waiting. "I will go with you," he said at last. "But we must travel at dawn, before the valley loses its patience." Elara let out a slow, relieved breath. "Thank you. My people will be grateful." Rogan nodded, but did not smile. A heaviness lay on the air around them, the same heaviness he had felt deep in the ground. Something was indeed calling, and he feared that the disturbance was older than Alara's village, older than the settlements across the northern ridges, older even than the hollow itself. He felt the wood of the valley vibrating faintly, almost like a heartbeat beneath the soil. Outside, the mist swirled in strange spirals, drifting as if stirred by unseen hands. Rogan lowered the shutters and stoked the fire. He could sense that the journey ahead would test more than his skill as a craftsman. It would test his understanding of the stories wood carried, and of the silence beneath them. As the night deepened, the valley remained hushed. Listening, Rogan did not sleep. He kept the wooden box beside him and waited for dawn, aware that whatever had awakened in the world of forests and timber was waiting as well. Dawn in Silent Hollow never broke with brilliance. It eased in slowly, like a thoughtful guest arriving quietly, so as not to disturb those who still rested. On the morning Rogan and Alara prepared to leave, the mist hung low and heavy, clinging to the earth as if reluctant to let them go. The stream beside the cottage murmured in shallow curls, its voice thinner than usual, as though even its waters wished to warn them of something waiting beyond the hills. Rogan packed lightly. He carried a water skin, a bundle of dried herbs, a small wooden mallet, and the slender listening tool of pale ash. Alara tended to her mule, fastening her modest belongings with practiced steadiness, though worry still shadowed her eyes. Rogan studied the mist drifting above the ground. It moved in slow, intentional coils, with a pattern that almost resembled breath. "The hollow watches," Rogan murmured. Alara pulled her cloak tighter. "Does it disapprove of our leaving?" "Not disapprove," he answered. "But it knows the path we follow is no simple road." With that, they began their ascent, out of the hollow. The climb up the first hill took time. The ground was slick with dew, and the fog wrapped itself around their ankles. But Rogan's steps were sure, guided by a lifetime of walking those lands. When they reached higher ground, the mist thinned enough to reveal the world beyond. The northern ridges stood in long dark lines across the horizon, their forests dense and brooding. They walked in patient silence. Alara's mule plodded faithfully behind them, its hooves making soft uneven thumps against the earth. As they traveled, Rogan's senses stretched outward, listening for the pulse he had felt the night before. Occasionally, the breeze carried the faint scent of old bark and damp moss, but beneath it lingered something sharper, something restless. It reminded him of timber that had been cut before it was ready, timber still crying out from the force of the axe. By midday they reached a small clearing where a lone pine stood bent toward the east, as if bowing to a memory no one else could see. Rogan paused and placed one hand on its trunk. The wood felt strained, though the tree itself still lived. He closed his eyes and listened. A faint tremor traveled through the grain beneath his palm. "This tree carries fear," he said softly. Alara stepped closer. "Fear of what?" "Change," Rogan replied. "Something is shifting in the land. The trees sense it before we do." She glanced at the forest stretching ahead. "Is it connected to what is happening in my village?" Rogan nodded for her to follow him. They continued northward, passing through woods that grew older with each mile. These were trees that had stood long before the first cottages were ever hammered together. Their trunks rose wide and tall, some twisted in shapes that hinted at storms of long ago. Rogan could feel the hum of their shared unrest vibrating faintly through the roots beneath the soil. As the shadows lengthened, they reached a forgotten path paved with moss. Alara slowed her steps. "This road looks ancient." "It is," Rogan said. "Older than the villages. Older even than the carved traditions I was taught. It once connected settlements that no longer exist." She looked down at the stone beneath her feet. "What happened to them?" Rogan took a moment before answering. "Some say they vanished after the forests turned against them." Alara stiffened. "Turned against them? Do you mean the wood itself?" Rogan did not respond, but his silence was answer enough. They pressed forward until they reached a cluster of abandoned structures hidden deep among the trees. The buildings were little more than skeletons of old timber frames, softened by time and draped in moss. Their beams had cracked, not from rot but from some other force, sudden and unnatural. Alara swallowed hard. "Is this what you meant?" she whispered. Rogan walked slowly through the ruins, brushing his fingers against the shattered frames. The timber felt cold and lifeless. He kneeled and placed the listening tool against a splintered joint, pressing his ear to the wood. For several long breaths he remained still. A faint whisper rose through the grain. At first it sounded like wind, soft and smooth, but gradually it formed a pattern, a rhythm. Not words, not truly, but something that imitated speech in a distant, mournful tone. It was the echo of something that had once moved freely through the forest, but now struggled, bound by pain. Rogan drew back and exhaled deeply. "The wood cries for release," he said. Ilara crouched beside him. "Release from what?" "From a severing," he replied. "Long ago something disrupted the forests that fed these villages. The harmony between the people and the land fractured. It has taken generations for the echo to awaken again, but it is stirring now, and your village is caught in its return." Ilara Sip's brow creased. "Why our village?" "Because your people harvest the northern grove," Rogan said quietly. "And the northern grove is where the oldest trees once stood." She closed her eyes, as if absorbing a truth she had feared. "I told my father the workers were cutting too far up the ridge. I told him the wood from those heights felt different, but we needed timber for winter, so he expanded the boundary." Rogan rose to his feet and surveyed the ancient ruins. There is a balance to be kept between the forest and those who take from it. When that balance is broken, the wood remembers. They resumed their journey, stepping past the remains of long-lost dwellings. The forest thickened as they moved north, and the air grew denser, carrying the faint sound of creaking branches, even when no wind stirred. Twilight deepened, filling the forest with long violet shadows. Rogan felt the tremor in the ground grow stronger. "We are close," he said. As night approached, they reached the base of the northern ridge. The slope ahead was steep, cloaked in ancient trees, whose trunks seemed to glow faintly in the dimming light. Their branches sagged under their own weight, but their roots pulsed with a quiet, unsettling energy. Ilara stepped back. "These woods feel wrong." "Not wrong," Rogan murmured. "Awake." The ridge rose before them like a living creature stirring from a long slumber. The wood around them whispered faintly, as if recognizing the presence of those who had come in search of its voice. Rogan tightened his grip on the listening tool. "Your village lies beyond this ridge, but whatever waits at the top is the heart of your trouble." Ilara drew a steadying breath. "Will we face it tonight?" "No," Rogan said. "Tonight the forest watches. Tomorrow it will speak." They set up a small camp beneath a leaning cedar, whose branches sheltered them from the night. Rogan built a modest fire with fallen limbs. Careful not to disturb any living wood, Ilara sat quietly beside the flames, lost in thought. In the darkness beyond the cedar's shadow, the forest whispered again, low, lingering, almost a warning. Rogan listened with grave patience. "Rest," he told Ilara. "At first light we climb." But he himself did not rest. He kept watch through the long still hours, aware that something moved through the trees, something ancient, something unsettled, something that had been waiting for someone who could hear it. And Rogan knew, with the weight of certainty in his bones, that dawn would not be gentle on the ridge above them. The first hint of dawn came not from light, but from sound. High on the ridge, a tremor rolled through the earth like a slow awakening breath, deep and resonant. Rogan felt it before he saw even a faint change in the sky. He sat where he had kept vigil most of the night, the embers of the fire still glowing gently beside him. Ilara stirred beneath her cloak, rising carefully, as if sensing that the forest itself expected her attention. "Is it morning?" she whispered. "In its own way," Rogan replied. The forest remained dim, the sun still hidden behind the heavy crown of thick ancient boughs, but the quiet around them had shifted. It was no longer a silence of sleep, it was the silence of waiting. Rogan stamped out the last warmth of the fire, and gathered his few belongings. Ilara did the same, her movements steady though her face showed unease. The mule grazed nervously at a tuft of grass and needed soothing before it would follow. The path that climbed the ridge was narrow, more a suggestion than a trail. Roots twisted over the ground like the remnants of old stories refusing to be forgotten. The climb was steep and demanded patience. Rogan walked ahead, placing each step with care, his listening tool tucked into his belt. Ilara followed close behind, one hand resting anxiously on the mule's rein. Halfway up, the trees began to change. Their trunks, once thick and straight, rose in spiraled curves, twisting as though shaped by the winding of ancient winds. Their bark bore streaks of pale silver that shimmered faintly when touched by the thin dawn light filtering through the canopy. Some trunks grew so close together that their branches intertwined in tight, knotted braids, almost like fingers clasped in silent fear. Alara paused before one such tree. These look nothing like the trees below. They are not the same, Rogan replied. These belong to the oldest grove. When the ridge was young, this forest anchored the land. Alara brushed her fingertips over the bark. It felt cool and strangely smooth. Beneath the surface she sensed a pulse, faint but real. It feels alive, she murmured. Rogan nodded. Everything here remembers. As they climbed higher, the forest grew quieter still. Even the small rustlings of insects seemed absent. The only sounds came from the shifting of roots beneath the soil, and the occasional soft groan of a tree adjusting its weight. The air thickened with the scent of old resin, a fragrance that carried both comfort and sorrow. Then, at last, they reached the crest of the ridge. The summit spread out in a broad overlook, open to the sky. The first rays of sunlight broke through in narrow golden lines, illuminating the clearing. In its center stood a colossal tree, unlike any Rogan had ever seen. It towered above the canopy below, its trunk wide as a cottage, its bark patterned with deep swirling grains that looked almost like writing. The roots stretched across the clearing, weaving into the earth in intricate pathways. Alara inhaled sharply. This is it. I can feel it. Rogan approached the great tree slowly. With each step, the hum in the ground grew louder, but it was not hostile. It was a call, a plea, a long-held breath finally ready to exhale. He placed both hands on the trunk. At once, a low vibration rose through the tree, traveling up his arms and settling deep in his chest. The sound was soft, not loud at all, yet it carried the weight of centuries. It told of storms long past, of villagers who once tended the grove with reverence, of the careful seasons when the forest and its people moved in harmony. But then it showed him something else. Something darker. A memory of axes biting into sacred wood. A memory of frightened roots, torn too quickly from the soil. A memory of balance disrupted. Rogan stepped back, steadying his breath. This is the heart of what your people awakened. Alara approached the tree. We did not mean to harm anything. Harm does not require intent, Rogan said gently. Only action without listening. Alara lowered her gaze, troubled. Then what must be done? Rogan knelt and pressed the listening tool into a deep groove along the tree's lower bark. He leaned close, allowing the wood's vibration to travel up the slender piece of ash. The hum shifted into a clearer pattern. Still not words, but unmistakably a request. The forest demands restoration, he murmured. Restoration? Alara echoed. How can we give that back? Rogan stood and pointed toward the distant foothills where her village lay beyond sight. Your people must cease cutting in the northern grove. The trees taken from those heights must be returned to the earth. Their remains must be laid to rest in the soil from which they came. Alara frowned. Laid to rest? Buried, Rogan clarified. Allowed to return to quiet decomposition. Allowed to rejoin the forest. Alara bit her lip. But much of that timber has already been used. Houses, fences, roof beams. Rogan nodded. Then they must be taken down. She stared at him in disbelief. The villagers will not accept that. They must, Rogan said softly. For if they do not listen now, the forest will no longer whisper its warnings. It will act. A gust of wind brushed over the ridge. The great tree shuddered, shedding a cascade of soft needles that drifted gently to the ground. Alara watched them fall, each one glowing faintly in the early morning light. She stepped closer to the tree, and placed her palm against it. The hum that traveled into her hand was gentle, almost comforting, but beneath that calm lay a deep reservoir of sorrow, an ache carried through ages. The tree is grieving, she whispered. Rogan nodded. It has lost much. Then I will speak with my father, she said. I will tell the village council everything. They may not listen to me, but they must hear you. Rogan remained quiet for a moment. I will come, but they must also hear the wood itself. How will they do that? She asked. He lifted the listening tool, with this, and with patience, and with willingness to understand. Alara looked into the forest below. The journey home would take much of the day, and the conversation ahead would require courage, but she felt a calm determination settle over her. The trees on the ridge seemed to recognize this shift, for the hum in the air softened. Rogan turned to her. Before we leave, the forest asks something more. Alara sips breath caught. What is it? A promise, Rogan replied. Not from your village. From you. She swallowed slowly. What kind of promise? That you will return, he said. Not today. Not soon. But one day, when the ridge calls again. Alara hesitated only a moment. Then she nodded. I promise. The ridge exhaled a long, slow breath of wind that swirled around them, brushing their hair and cloaks. It felt almost like acknowledgement. Rogan stepped back from the great tree and bowed his head in quiet respect. Alara did the same. When they began the descent, the air around them felt lighter. The forest no longer carried the tight hum of distress. Instead, it moved with the ease of something that had been heard at last. Their journey down through the spiraled trunks passed in peaceful silence. Even the mule walked with less apprehension. As the morning grew brighter, the sounds of distant birds returned, tentative at first, but gradually bold enough to fill the forest with calls. By the time they reached their camp from the night before, Alara paused and looked back at the ridge. It already seems calmer, she said. It is, Rogan replied. But it waits. It watches to see if your people will honor what has been asked. Alara nodded thoughtfully. Will you help me convince them? She asked. I will help, Rogan said. But the voice they must heed is not mine. It is the voice of the wood, and the forest speaks most clearly through those who choose to listen. Alara exhaled softly, steady with purpose. Then I will listen. As they continued toward her village, Rogan walked a few steps behind, listening to the trees as he always had. The forest no longer whispered warnings. Its voice was quieter now, softened into a gentle murmur that drifted through the branches, like a sigh of cautious hope. But deep within that murmur, Rogan sensed something else, a lingering thought, a question the forest seemed to ask in return. Would the villagers truly hear what the ridge had spoken? Only time would tell. You find yourself wandering through the soft corridors of time, stepping into a world where wealth was not measured in coins or jewels, but in sacks of grain neatly stored behind wooden doors. In this story, you will travel to a far quieter corner of history, a place where power rested not with the warriors or senators, but with a meticulous man hunched over a wooden table, tallying barley with a reed pen, a place where the smallest miscalculation could bring an entire village to ruin long before drought or invaders ever arrived. The year sits somewhere in the early Roman Republic, a time before emperors, before marble monuments, before the great feasts that later generations would imagine when speaking of Rome. Here, in this early age, the land breathes in slow rhythms. Most people live in small communities, where the smell of earth clings to everything, where grain is more precious than silver, and where every household knows that winter survival depends upon the accuracy of quiet men like Marcus Varro, the village tally keeper. Marcus lives on the edge of a rural settlement called Castrum Vetus, a place that rarely appears in grand chronicles. It lies far from the bustling markets of the capital. Instead, it sits among wide fields of wheat that sway like a trembling sea whenever the wind drifts across them. The houses are simple, built of packed dirt and timber, their roofs covered with straw so thick it holds warmth long after the evening fires die. Marcus's world revolves around the granary, a long rectangular building supported by thick beams, set upon raised stone platforms to keep the grain safe from rodents and floodwater. It is not beautiful in any grand sense, but it is sturdy, dependable, and built with the kind of care that suggests its purpose is sacred. For the villagers of Castrum Vetus, it is. Each morning Marcus rises before the sun, stepping outside his small cottage to breathe in the lingering coolness of the fading night. Dew clings to the grass, sparkling faintly in the silver dawn. The village dogs stretch and shake the sleep from their limbs, trotting past him toward the fields where their owners will soon be ploughing. Marcus starts his day the same way he has for many years, by walking toward the granary with a reed pen tucked behind one ear and a thin ledger tucked under his arm. The granary greets him with silence. Dust lies thick on its stone steps. Its wooden door groans with age, as though it wishes to hold its secrets a little longer. Marcus pushes it open and enters a world of shadows and soft, earthy smells. Inside, shafts of pale morning light shine through small shuttered openings near the roof, illuminating floating grains of dust that dance in slow spirals. The granary is divided into rows of clay-lined pits, each filled with a different measure of grain. Some contain barley, some wheat, some spelt. Marcus knows each one intimately, as though they were old companions whose moods he can sense with a simple glance. He kneels beside the first pit of the morning, dipping a carved wooden scoop into the grain and lifting it to inspect the kernels. He assesses their dryness, their weight, the faint scent that tells him whether the harvest has aged well or whether moisture threatens to rot it from within. Then he writes. His ledger is filled with long lists of numbers and careful notes, each written with the same deliberate hand. He records the measure of each pit, the condition of the kernels, the rate at which each household withdrew its share during the previous days. Nothing escapes his attention. Even the faintest sign of mold, or the smallest deviation in weight is documented with seriousness. It is easy to overlook men like Marcus in the larger sweep of history. Tales tend to remember generals, kings and philosophers, but here, in this small settlement, Marcus holds a different kind of power, one that is often invisible. For the village cannot afford mistakes. If he records too much grain for a family, another may go hungry by winter. If he records too little, suspicion and conflict might rip through the community as sharply as any blade. Yet Marcus does not think of his work in terms of power. To him, it is duty. He often recalls a lesson his father taught him. A man who had kept the granary before him. Grain, his father said, is trust. It belongs to all and to none. You hold it for the future, not for yourself. Marcus carries this lesson like a quiet prayer. As the sun lifts higher, Marcus leaves the granary to visit the fields. He observes the early ploughing, watching oxen drag wooden ploughs through soil that smells rich and moist after a recent rain. Farmers greet him with nods, knowing his presence is not idle. Marcus evaluates soil conditions, estimates how well the next harvest might fare, and listens to the murmured worries of neighbors who speak of storms, pests, or unexpected changes in weather. Back at the granary, he organizes the distribution of today's rations. Families line up with woven baskets, receiving the amount allotted to them. Some thank him, others grunt their acknowledgement. A few, as always, peer suspiciously at the scoop as if convinced that Marcus's hand weighs differently for one household than another. But no one dares openly question his work. He writes every measure in the ledger, letting the ink dry before he moves to the next entry. By midday, Marcus retreats to the shade of a fig tree outside the granary. He eats a modest meal of bread and olives, savoring the quiet. Children play in the dust nearby, drawing crude shapes with sticks. Their laughter carries on the wind, mingling with the low murmur of village life unfolding around him. Yet even in these peaceful hours, Marcus's mind remains occupied. He has noticed something troubling in the grain pits over the past few mornings. A faint mustiness clings to one corner of the granary. It is subtle, easy for another man to ignore, but not for Marcus. The kernels in one pit felt slightly softer than they should. When he pressed a handful between his fingers earlier, they did not release the same dry powder he was accustomed to. Something is changing. The air inside the granary has grown slightly warmer. He has seen condensation forming near one of the clay linings. Perhaps the stones beneath the structure have shifted, allowing moisture to creep upward. Perhaps a storm some days past seeped into the roof in a place he did not notice. Moisture is the enemy of stored grain. Mold, once it begins, spreads like a creeping shadow that cannot be pushed back without great effort. Marcus finishes his meal and returns to the granary with renewed vigilance. He walks its length slowly, listening for subtle sounds. The silence feels heavier today, more watchful. He kneels beside the questionable pit and draws a deeper handful of grain, bringing it to his nose. He inhales. There it is again, the faintest sourness. Not enough to alarm the village. Not yet. But enough to unsettle Marcus. He checks the roof beams. He inspects the clay lining. He runs his hand along the stones. The granary is old. Older than he is. Older even than his father had been when he passed the duty to Marcus. Buildings of earth and wood have limits. Time wears them down grain by grain, unnoticed until one day the entire structure gives way. Marcus sets aside his scoop and wipes his hands on his tunic. His ledger remains open on the table beside him. He glances at it, the rows of numbers, a clear reminder of how much depends on his ability to see problems before others do. He writes a short note. Dampness suspected in lower western pit. Investigation required. Possible roof repair or lining reinforcement. But even as he writes, a question presses against his thoughts. What if the problem is larger than a repair? What if the earth beneath the granary has shifted enough to threaten the foundation itself? Marcus steps outside, shielding his eyes from the bright afternoon sun. The villagers continue with their work, unaware of the quiet battle being waged inside their storage building. Marcus's brow furrows slightly as he considers what must come next. He will need to speak to the elders. He will need assistance to lift and shift the stored grain elsewhere. He will need to plan for repairs long before winter arrives. The granary holds enough food to keep the entire settlement alive through the cold months ahead. If it falters, so too does the village. Marcus breathes deeply and turns back toward the granary. The soft sound of settling dust reaches his ears, carried on a faint draft. He senses again the subtle instability lurking in the old structure. The question that forms in his mind is one he cannot ignore. What hidden weakness lurks beneath the granary floor, waiting for someone to notice it before it becomes too late? You step again into the silent world of medieval monastic timekeeping, where every moment is expected to pass with the steadiness of a drop of water falling through a narrow opening. In Section 1, you explored how monks became the custodians of time when the outside world often struggled to measure it with consistency. Now in this second part, you move deeper into the routines that defined the work of these monastic timekeepers. You will focus on the body of habits and practices that made the water clock not simply a device, but a disciplined way of living that shaped the rhythm of the entire community. When you imagine a monastery in the Middle Ages, you might picture a place of deep, quiet stone cloisters and soft candlelight. Yet behind that quiet surface existed a very controlled machinery of routine. Everything operated according to an internal system that was built on the steady passing of time. Monastic life required a constant return to prayer, writing, tending the grounds, copying texts, and maintaining the fragile mechanisms that kept this structure synchronized. While many of these duties were shared, the care of the water clock rested in the hands of a few. These monks learned to interpret the passage of water with a degree of attention and patience that the outside world rarely demanded. Each monastery had slightly different methods, but all agreed on one principle: the clock never stopped. Day and night, its container had to remain filled, its flow had to remain unbroken, and its receiving bowl had to be monitored, so that the marks etched along its inner walls could be read with accuracy. If the night was long, cold, or windy, the water might move more slowly. If the day grew warm, it could flow more quickly. The time monk needed to make constant small adjustments, shifting the ladle size, changing the water temperature, or checking the alignment of the bowl to ensure accuracy. Imagine this monk, alone in the dim chamber where the clock was kept. The sound around him is faint, a distant rustle of robes, the quiet echo of footsteps, the wind pressing lightly against old stone walls. In front of him sits a simple vessel raised on a platform. A slow stream falls from a minor opening, each drop behaving like its own small task, forming a narrow thread that stretches downward. The monk watches it, not as a person watching water, but as a guardian watching a boundary. If the thread becomes too thick, time will run ahead of itself. If the stream becomes thin, the hours will stretch too far. His task is to intervene just enough to keep the world measured. This type of work created a relationship between the monk and the passage of time that was entirely different from the one most people experience. Rather than waiting for moments to come or fade, he was charged with maintaining them. His attention held the passing hours steady. In this way he became both servant and master of time. He served it by tending the device, but he also shaped it through his corrections and perceptions. This responsibility did not end when he left the chamber. Monastic discipline required him to be aware of time, even when he moved through gardens, halls, or the scriptoria. He needed to predict when the next prayer bell should ring, when meals should begin, or when the community should gather for work. As he copied manuscripts or tended the library shelves, he held a portion of his attention on the rhythm of the water dripping behind the walls. This created a subtle tension in his routine. The monastery valued contemplation, stillness, and focus, yet the maintenance of time required constant checks. He could not allow himself to drift too deeply into thought, nor could he let his mind wander beyond the monastery's needs. In this sense, his role resembled that of a watchman, except that he guarded no gate and raised no alarm. He guarded the simple fact that the hours moved forward evenly. A curious detail emerges when you reflect on how the monks integrated their clocks into the nightly hours. In the deep dark, the water clock became the only reliable guide. Without sunlight, without stars when the clouds hid the sky, without the outdoor noises that signaled activity, the steady drip served as the skeleton of the entire schedule. Night prayers, readings, and meditations all depended on the vigilance of the timekeeper. If he fell asleep, time inside the monastery would drift into confusion. Bells would ring late or early, duties would overlap, the fragile balance between waking, working, and resting would collapse. For this reason, monasteries often divided the night into watches, Each watch was assigned to 1 to 3 monks, depending on the size of the community. They rotated through the hours, checking the clock, adjusting the flow, and ringing the bell when needed. This rotation created a shared responsibility that linked the monks together in a chain of vigilance. Through this shared rhythm, they learned to trust one another not simply as companions in faith, but as custodians of the daily order. Another detail that shaped the monastic relationship with time was the link between the water clock and prayer. Monastic rules required prayer at set hours, but the actual ringing of the bell came only when the time monk read the bowl. This meant that the clock did not control the prayers by itself. The monk interpreted its signals. He looked at the water, saw how much had gathered, and declared that the next moment had arrived. This gave him a role that bordered on symbolic authority. He became a living bridge between the mechanical and the spiritual. Because of this, monasteries often held their time monks in quiet respect. They were not always scholars or leaders. Many were simply patient individuals whose strength lay in steadiness and careful observation. Their contribution was subtle, but essential. The entire community depended on their ability to ensure that each day carried the same shape as the one before it. In the Middle Ages, when villages and towns often relied on sun position or church bells from above the hills, the monastery's system of timekeeping was considered unusually consistent. Travelers sometimes reported that monastic bells rang at the same moments each day, even in difficult weather. This was not because the outside world lacked awareness, but rather because the lives of common people were shaped by tasks rather than hours. A farmer worked by natural light. A merchant organized his activities according to the opening of the market. A shepherd followed the rhythm of his animals. Monks, in contrast, followed the rhythm of the water. This distinction created an interesting form of separation between monastic time and the time experienced by the surrounding countryside. Inside the monastery, the hours were preserved like ordered rows of tools in a workshop. Outside, time stretched, shrank, or scattered, depending on needs and circumstances. The monastery became, in this way, a container for collective discipline. Its structure helped preserve learning, writing, and reflection through centuries of uncertainty. The water clock was not the only device that shaped monastic time, but it was one of the most consistent. Candles, marked with lines, could measure the night, but drafts or imperfections in the wax caused them to burn at uneven rates. Sundials were accurate only in daylight. Hourglasses, though simple, required frequent turning and could be thrown off by slight changes in sand texture. The water clock, for all its challenges, offered a balance between predictability and manual correction. It produced a rhythm that demanded collaboration rather than mechanical perfection. This collaboration extended into unexpected places. For example, when monks copied manuscripts, the pace of their work often aligned with the regular checks of the clock. They paused at intervals, stretched their hands, examined the pages, and returned to writing with renewed focus. This created a gentle cycle that shaped the physical production of books. In a sense, the slow movement of water indirectly influenced the structure of medieval knowledge itself. Another area influenced by this timekeeping method was monastic agriculture. Monks relied heavily on observation of seasons and soil conditions, but their daily tasks, watering gardens, tending beehives, caring for livestock, were also linked to the clock. The regular schedule created a reliable pattern for both soil and body. Plants were watered at consistent intervals, livestock were fed on a predictable routine, and fields were tended with slow but steady dedication. The clock did not tell them when to plant or harvest, but it helped organize the smaller details that made the larger tasks manageable. This steady pattern might seem dull, yet in its simplicity lies the key to why it mattered. The water clock offered a structure that allowed monks to focus on contemplation without losing track of the physical world around them. It created a bridge between action and reflection, between the natural flow of life and the structured shape of practice. In doing so, it also allowed the monastery to maintain stability through periods of political change, economic strain, or social uncertainty. As you consider all these elements, you begin to see that the monks who cared for these clocks were not simply technicians. They were caretakers of routine, guardians of an ordered existence. They carried a quiet responsibility that shaped the lives of everyone around them. And yet, in spite of all this steady attention, one could not ignore the fragility of their system. All it took was a brief lapse, an unexpected disruption, a moment of illness, a storm that rattled the chamber, to throw the entire schedule into disorder. This vulnerability raises a final question, one that leads naturally into the final section of this story. with so much depending on a device as delicate and changeable as a bowl of water. How did the monks cope when the clock failed? You return now to the dim chamber where the water clock stands. 2 sections ago you entered the world of monastic timekeeping, where hours were shaped not by sunlight or bronze tools, but by the patient descent of water through a narrow opening. In the previous part, you observed how the monks learned to interpret that flow, how their entire existence leaned on the quiet labor of a few who tended the clock through cold nights and warm afternoons. Now, in this final section, you explore what happened when that delicate system failed. For all its usefulness, the water clock was not a flawless instrument. Everyone in the monastery knew that its accuracy depended on a balance that could shift without warning. A slight tilt in the bowl, a grain lodged in the opening, a change in water temperature, or the settling of the wooden stand beneath it, could alter the rate of flow. Even the calmest monk understood that time inside the monastery was always on the edge of slipping from order into uncertainty. When such a failure occurred, it usually began with something small. Perhaps the night watch monk arrived for his usual inspection and found the receiving vessel less filled than expected. Or perhaps the sound of dripping changed in a way almost impossible to describe, a faint hesitation in the rhythm that the experienced ear could notice only after years of tending the device. Sometimes the failure came from an unexpected draft that cooled the water too quickly, causing the flow to slow. At other times, a warm fire lit too close would thin the water and quicken the pace. These disruptions could lead to a cascade of confusion. If the water ran too fast, the bell for early morning prayer might ring before the eastern sky even began to lighten. If it ran too slow, monks might remain in bed long after the proper time, unsure why the bell had not sounded. It was not only the schedule of prayer that depended on the clock. Meal distribution, work assignments, rotation of night watches, reading hours, and even the times set aside for silent contemplation all rested on the steady rhythm of dripping water. In one recorded case from a northern European monastery, the clock malfunctioned during a winter storm. The temperature within the stone chamber dropped enough to slow the flow to nearly nothing. The night watch monk, half asleep, simply assumed the bowl had emptied and that the time had come to ring the bell. He struck it with full force. The sound rolled through sleeping quarters where no one expected it, and confusion spread through the long hallways. Monks stumbled from their cots uncertain whether they had overslept or whether an emergency had occurred. By the time the mistake was realized, the schedule for the entire day had drifted far from its intended shape. Events like this were rarely treated harshly. Instead, they became quiet lessons in patience and adaptation. After all, the monks did not keep time to dominate nature. They kept it to bring order to their tasks. When the clock faltered, they adjusted the system, rather than blaming the individual who watched over it. They recorded the cause, made changes to prevent repetition, and returned to the slow work of maintaining the hours. The monks also developed strategies for recognizing early signs of failure. Some established double checks, placing a marked candle beside the water bowl to compare its burn rate with the expected fill line. Others hung a small stone weight near the end of the receiving chain, allowing them to sense even minor shifts in the flow based on the weight's movement. In some monasteries, the clock was placed within a specially constructed alcove designed to minimize drafts or temperature shifts. These were not ambitious inventions but small adjustments meant to help the monks guard their schedule. When the failure of the clock became obvious, the community responded with remarkable calm. The monks stood ready to reorder their day based on judgment rather than resemblance to precise measurement. This flexibility was essential because their purpose was not to force time into a rigid shape. Their purpose was to maintain a rhythm that supported their shared life. A late bell might disrupt their routine, but it did not disturb their intention. What is striking when you explore this history is how disciplined and yet forgiving their system had to be. The water clock demanded constant attention, yet it would never truly be perfect. The monks accepted this imperfection, not with frustration, but with a kind of humility. They understood that time itself did not belong to them. They were only caretakers of its structure within their walls. This attitude shaped the way they lived. When they tended gardens or copied manuscripts, they carried the awareness that their tasks would eventually pause for prayer or a common duty. When they prayed, they did so knowing that their practice was bounded by human attempts to measure something that moved with a rhythm far greater than their own. This awareness gave their work a steady, almost quiet dignity. They did not hurry, for hurrying made little sense in a world marked by careful drips of water. They did not resist adjustments, for they knew that change was part of the system they served. Their approach to time, though rigid in structure, was gentle in execution. As the centuries passed, the water clock maintained its presence in some monasteries, even when mechanical clocks with gears and weights began to spread across Europe. These mechanical devices brought a much sharper precision, ringing bells at intervals that no human timekeeper needed to interpret. Yet many monasteries kept their water clocks for far longer than necessary. They knew that the device was less accurate, but they valued its simplicity. They valued the patience it demanded, the calmness it encouraged, and the steady attention it had cultivated within their communities. Eventually, however, even these gentle devices faded. Monasteries adopted mechanical clocks, bells connected to iron gears, and systems that no longer required a monk to watch a stream of water through the long hours of the night. The role of the time monk disappeared. The watches ended. The chamber where the clock once stood fell silent. Some of these water clocks were set aside in storerooms, forgotten until modern historians rediscovered them. Others vanished entirely, leaving only descriptions in old manuscripts. Yet their legacy endured. The impact of their work can still be traced in the discipline that defined monastic life. The rhythm of structured hours became central to monasteries long after the tools that first shaped that rhythm had been replaced. That pattern influenced not only religious life, but the broader development of European timekeeping. The very idea that a day could be divided reliably into segments, each with its own purpose and expectation, gained strength from centuries of monastic practice. You might even sense a trace of this influence in the modern world. Many of the patterns you follow, regular work hours, designated times for rest, the expectation that events begin at set moments, owe something to those monks who guarded the steady drip of water in the dark chambers of the medieval monastery. Their quiet labor helped shape the world into one where time became a shared structure rather than a loose impression. As this story closes, you are left with a simple question. When time became something precise, something controlled by machines and no longer shaped by the slow movement of water, did humanity gain something valuable, or did it lose a measure of the stillness that once defined the passing hours? You now step into a quieter but equally important corner of the medieval world, far removed from the monastic halls of flowing water and measured hours. Here, you walk into a landscape shaped by fields, storage barns, and the records kept by patient hands. In this story, you explore the individuals who maintained order in one of the most unremarkable yet essential tasks of the age, keeping track of grain. Their work supported a system that allowed villages, estates, and entire regions to survive across years of good and poor harvests. These were the grain ledger keepers, the men and sometimes women who oversaw the collection, accounting, and distribution of a resource so ordinary that it was rarely noticed unless it failed. To understand these keepers, you must first picture the agricultural world that surrounded them. Most medieval communities lived by the harvest. Fields stretched outward from villages in long strips assigned to families, tenants, or laborers. Oxen moved slowly across the land at ploughing time, their steady progress measured not by speed but by endurance. Seeds were sown by hand in deliberate arcs, and the entire year unfolded through a predictable but unforgiving cycle. Rainfall, sunlight, soil quality, and labor worked together to decide the size of the harvest. When the grain came in abundance, there was a measure of relief. When it came in poorly, fear entered the community like a draft under a door. Grain was not simply food. It was currency, labor payment, rent, security, and the foundation of both diet and economy. It could be stored, measured, traded, or milled into flour. Because of its importance, someone had to keep reliable records, especially for large estates, monasteries overseeing tenant lands, and towns that required regulated supply for markets and bakers. This responsibility fell to the grain ledger keepers. You might imagine a large storeroom filled with the smell of dust, chaff, and dried husks. In the center of this space sits a simple wooden table. Upon it lies a parchment ledger bound in leather, with ink pots and reed pens arranged beside it. The ledger keeper sits with his back to the open door, where the light of afternoon spills across the floor. Workers approach carrying sacks or baskets filled with harvested grain. Their steps raise small clouds of dust that settle in slow drifting patterns. The keeper records each contribution, who brought it, how much it weighed, and where it would be stored. The task required both accuracy and patience. Grain was slippery, shifting under pressure, and difficult to measure without careful tools. Medieval measurements varied by region, with units such as bushels, firkins, modia, and sacks, each with its own size depending on local custom. The ledger keeper had to know these standards well, adjusting for dampness, density, and the slight variations caused by different types of grain. Barley did not weigh the same as wheat, and rye had its own character. The keeper's job demanded familiarity with all three. Often the ledger keeper had a helper who weighed the grain using balance scales. These scales consisted of a central beam suspended from a hook, with pans hanging on each side. Known weights made from stone, bronze, or lead were placed on one pan while grain was poured into the other. When the beam leveled, the measurement was recorded. It was simple in principle, yet surprisingly delicate. A slight tilt of the wooden table, a gust of air, or the uneven settling of grain in the pan could shift the result. Thus, the keeper learned to watch not only the mechanics, but the behavior of grain itself. Because of this, ledger keeping was a practice shaped by observation. The keeper could tell from touch whether a batch had been harvested early. He could identify moisture by the faintest cling between the grains. He knew whether the sacks had been woven tightly, or if their contents would shift too freely. His job involved more than numbers. It required an understanding of the material he worked with. There was also a social dimension to this role. Tenants sometimes disputed measurements, fearing that an inaccurate record could impose extra dues or rents. Workers occasionally delayed bringing their harvest, hoping to avoid the busiest hours. Some individuals attempted to pass off lower quality grain, adding straw or chaff to increase weight. The ledger keeper had to navigate these small tensions with steady calm. His authority grew not from force or public declarations but from a reputation for fairness and consistency. If a keeper was known to misjudge or show favoritism, trust dissolved and disputes increased sharply. For large estates, grain was stored in multiple barns. Some were designed specifically for long-term storage, with elevated floors to prevent moisture from rising from the ground. Others were simple sheds meant for short periods before milling. The ledger keeper oversaw the distribution between these spaces, choosing where the grain should rest based on its type and expected use. Wheat usually went to the better protected barns, for it spoiled more easily. Barley and rye could be placed in simpler buildings. In some regions, especially across northern Europe, grain was stored in circular or rectangular barns with small ventilation openings at the top. These structures allowed air to circulate, reducing the risk of mold, but they also invited unwanted guests, birds and rodents. Thus another part of the ledger keeper's work involved checking for signs of intrusion. A few kernels spilled near the entrance, a faint rustling in the rafters, or a trail of droppings could signal a problem that required immediate attention. Pest control in the medieval world was an ongoing challenge. Cats lived near barns for this reason. Sometimes small traps were set. In severe cases, workers examined every corner of the barn with torches, though this carried obvious risks. If a barn caught fire, the loss was devastating. The ledger keeper, therefore, kept detailed notes of any sign of infestation, knowing that the condition of grain was as important as its quantity. Another responsibility that often fell to the keeper was monitoring grain shrinkage. Even well-stored grain lost weight over time. Some of it dried out, some settled more densely in storage, some was eaten by pests that managed to evade the defenses. Shrinkage had to be recorded carefully so that neither the landowners nor the tenants were blamed unfairly. A small change might be natural, a large one might signal a deeper issue. The ledger keeper also managed the schedule for milling. Grain could not remain in storage indefinitely. Each village or estate had a mill staffed by millers who ground grain into flour. Milling had its own system of fees and tolls, often paid as a portion of the grain itself. The keeper tracked these movements, ensuring that grain left storage at appropriate times and that the millers returned the correct portion of flour to the estate or village. You can imagine the flow of activity on a typical autumn day during harvest season. Workers carried baskets of freshly cut grain. The air was heavy with dust. Oxen hauled carts toward the barns. Children ran between piles of straw, and all the while, the ledger keeper sat with quiet focus at his table, recording each arrival. His work formed the backbone of this entire operation. Without the ledger, chaos could rapidly spread. Without accurate records, rents could not be collected, tithes could not be distributed, and winter provisions could not be planned. The keeper's presence extended into winter as well. When the days grew short and the land frostbound, he walked among the storage barns with a lantern. He listened for faint sounds that suggested moisture or movement. He examined walls for discoloration. He checked the grain levels against his recorded values. Most villagers rested or focused on indoor tasks during this season, but the keeper's responsibilities continued quietly in the cold. This slow work shaped a type of patience unique to the role. The keeper did not chase excitement or change. He observed the gradual settling of grain, the slow shift of weight, the passage of months as supplies slowly decreased. He learned to read the winter not as a dormant period, but as a steady unfolding of risk. Spoilage, theft, and miscalculation were constant possibilities. The keeper's records also played an important part in local planning. If the grain stores looked weak early in the winter, he informed the village head, estate steward, or monastic cellarer. This could lead to ration adjustments, increased vigilance in storage, or decisions to purchase grain from nearby towns before shortages worsened prices. In a world without rapid transport or communication, such foresight was essential. This attention to detail did not make the ledger keeper a prominent figure. Few people outside the estate or monastery ever knew his name. He wrote no proclamations, oversaw no councils, and held no formal power. Yet, his work shaped the daily survival of hundreds of people. Grain was the foundation of their diet, and his records determined how long that foundation would last. His calm presence ensured that households received their rightful share, that tithes reached the church, and that rents were distributed fairly. It is interesting to consider how much responsibility rested on the accuracy of his handwriting. A small slip of the pen could shift the numbers, a smudged mark could confuse a measurement, a misread entry could lead to conflict. For this reason, many keepers developed a distinctive, careful script, slow and deliberate. The parchment they wrote on had value. Ink had to be mixed from natural materials. Pens had to be trimmed. Every entry mattered. You might imagine the keeper at the end of a long day, sitting by a small brazier, warming his hands before closing the ledger. He examines the pages once more, moving his finger slowly along the columns, checking the alignment. Outside the door, the sounds of evening begin to settle across the village. Livestock are brought to shelter, workers drift toward their homes, the air cools, but he continues his work until the numbers feel correct. This role created a quiet bond between the keeper and the community. People trusted him because he represented fairness. They depended on him because his records shaped their daily bread. Yet, for all its quiet importance, his role was fragile. If his records were lost, damaged, or altered, the entire structure could collapse. A fire, a flood, or an unexpected illness could disrupt everything. And so, as this section closes, you might find yourself wondering, in a world where so much depended on careful records and the steady hand of one person, what happened when the ledger itself fell into doubt? The day after harvest was never quiet. Even within the seemingly orderly world of the grain houses, the ledger keeper, whose name may have been lost to history, rose with the dawn, reed pen in hand and parchment ledger open, ready to confront the smallest deviations in the piles of wheat and barley. Outside, workers adjusted to the frost-laden mornings, their breath visible in the air, their footsteps crunching across hardened soil. But inside, the keeper's attention was entirely on the grain. As the seasons passed, patterns emerged, subtle but insistent. Grain shifted slightly in its storage pits. Sacks that had been weighed yesterday were now slightly lighter. Moisture that had been checked and recorded continued to gather in corners. Rats and mice had learned to navigate the barn walls with cunning patience. The ledger keeper noticed all of it, recording the changes carefully, adjusting the measurements, and correcting the balance sheets to reflect what had been lost, consumed, or spoiled. These adjustments were not simply numbers, they were signals, warnings that the harvest was never truly safe, that the storehouses were alive in their own way, and that the village's survival depended on a constant dialogue between people and the stored grain. One small miscalculation could have cascading effects. A household that received too little would grow hungry. Too much, and another might be short. The delicate system of sustenance balanced on meticulous observation and quiet judgment. On a particularly cold morning, the ledger keeper noticed a subtle dampness along the floorboards of one barn. At first it appeared minor, perhaps condensation from the chill, but the careful observer sensed the pattern was growing. He ran his hand along the wood, noting its texture and temperature. He sniffed the air, aware of the faint musty smell that signaled beginning rot. The grain itself felt heavier in his hand, slightly sticky, a sign that moisture had begun to compromise its integrity. He immediately called for assistance. Villagers were hesitant. Many feared disturbing the stored grain, concerned that moving it would lead to further loss. Yet the keeper's calm authority prevailed. Together, they moved sacks to another, better ventilated building, weighing each portion, inspecting each kernel. The process was painstaking. Some of the grain was already damaged, and had to be set aside for animal feed rather than human consumption. Even so, Every effort was made to preserve as much as possible. The ledger reflected every detail: the original measure, the amount lost, the new allocation, the date of transfer, and the location of each sack. The keeper wrote slowly and deliberately, ensuring that anyone who might consult the records in the future could trace each movement. Mistakes once entered could spread distrust. Accuracy was a form of protection, not only for the grain but for the social fabric of the village. By midday, the barn was reorganized. Dust swirled in the air as workers moved sacks, the sunlight falling through open slats in faint shafts. The smell of grain mixed with dampness and straw, a tangible reminder of the constant struggle against natural forces. The keeper inspected each pit again, taking detailed notes on moisture, weight, and grain condition. Even after hours of labor, he did not relax until the ledger mirrored the reality of the granary perfectly. Yet even this careful attention could not prevent other forms of challenge. The village faced additional pressures. Neighboring estates sometimes demanded trade or loaned grain, and disputes over tithes or contributions to the church could strain relationships. The ledger keeper's records were essential in these interactions. When the priest requested the customary tithe, the keeper presented an exact account. When a neighbor questioned the village's share, he consulted the ledger. His ability to translate the physical reality of the harvest into a precise record maintained trust and stability. The work was lonely in its way. Few understood the daily minutiae that defined the keeper's world. Most villagers saw only the results: measured distributions, resolved disputes, and a sense of order. But behind the scenes, the ledger keeper's life was a series of repetitive, disciplined tasks. Each day he repeated the inspection of grain, the weighing of sacks, and the careful recording of numbers. Each day he learned more about how small changes could escalate into shortages or conflict. In the late afternoon, he sometimes paused to walk among the barns, hands clasped behind his back. He observed the settling grain, listened for the faint sound of shifting kernels, checked the ventilation of each building. The world outside could be unpredictable: storms, thieves, and disease. But within these walls, he cultivated predictability. In this practice, he became part of the grain itself, his attention flowing into each sack, each measure, until he and the harvest were intertwined. Despite his meticulous care, uncertainty remained. Weather could destroy the next season's crop. Storage could fail. Human error could creep into even the best-kept ledger. These possibilities weighed upon him like the very sacks he inspected. Yet he accepted them as part of the work. To survive in the medieval world, to ensure the village did not face hunger, required vigilance, adaptability, and a willingness to confront imperfection. The ledger keeper's role extended into planning for the future. He examined historical records, noting which seasons had brought more successful harvests and which had failed. He suggested rotations for crops to improve soil fertility. He advised on barn construction and maintenance to prevent moisture intrusion. His influence was subtle but foundational. Without him, the village's food supply would become a gamble with consequences for every household. As evening fell, the keeper closed the barns and returned to his table. By the flickering light of a small oil lamp, he reviewed the day's records once more. Every column was checked, every note confirmed. The ink had dried on pages that documented the ongoing story of survival, one day at a time. Outside, the village grew still, shadows stretching across the paths and fields. The air smelled of straw, smoke, and earth, calm and heavy with the memory of labor. Even as he prepared to rest, one question remained unresolved. A single small damp patch had been found earlier in the day, but could it be only the beginning? What if moisture had already spread unseen beneath the floorboards, silently compromising years of careful measurement? Could the ledger, so precise and unyielding, ever fully capture the invisible threats lurking in the granary? It was a thought that would follow him into the night, as it had followed every keeper before him. For in the world of grain and record-keeping, certainty was always provisional, and vigilance never ended. The night settled quietly over the village, yet inside the granary, the work of the ledger-keeper never truly ended. After the day's labor of weighing, recording, and redistributing the harvest, there remained one more task: reflection and anticipation. The keeper reviewed his entries, traced each number, compared the previous year's totals, and mentally prepared for the uncertainties the next season might bring. In a world without refrigeration, insurance, or rapid communication, such foresight was essential. Grain did not wait, and neither could those who depended upon it. This phase of the work revealed the ledger keeper's dual role as both historian and strategist. Every entry was a record of what had been, but it also served as guidance for what might come. which barns were most prone to moisture, which sacks had shown signs of gradual spoilage, which harvests had yielded less than expected. These were not idle observations. Each note shaped future decisions, the timing of planting, the allocation of labor, and even agreements with neighboring communities for trade or loan supplies. Inaccuracies could ripple outward, affecting not only the village, but also relationships with the surrounding estates and clergy. Occasionally, the keeper consulted the most experienced farmers, elders whose memories reached back decades. They spoke of winters with unexpected frost, of wet summers that turned wheat to mush, and of lean years when barley barely sustained the village. The ledger keeper combined these accounts with the precise numbers in his records. His calculations were not mechanical. They were interpretive. He learned to see the grain not just as weight or volume, but as an indicator of resilience. Each kernel carried information about soil, weather, and human effort. Even small errors in this system could have tangible consequences. A misread measurement could underfeed a household, causing hidden suffering, or overall grain, depleting reserves for future months. The ledger keeper's meticulous attention became a form of quiet power. The community trusted him to translate a variable, unpredictable natural world into an orderly system that safeguarded life. Yet he remained humble, aware that one failure could undo months of careful work. During particularly difficult winters, when frost seeped through barn walls or unexpected moisture threatened entire pits, the keeper orchestrated emergency measures. Grain would be moved to higher, drier barns. Floors might be reinforced with straw layers. Cats and other pest deterrents were mobilized. Nothing was left to chance. Even then, he recorded each intervention in his ledger, noting which methods proved effective and which were less reliable. Over time, these notes formed a body of knowledge that strengthened the village's long-term survival. Beyond practical concerns, the ledger keeper's work had social significance. Villagers knew that the distribution of grain was fair because it was anchored in exact records. Families relied on these measurements to plan meals, allocate labor, and prepare for festivals. In an era when justice and survival were closely intertwined, the keeper's impartiality prevented disputes, preserved trust, and allowed the village to function despite inevitable hardship. Yet the work was not without its hidden pressures. When unexpected events occurred, a delayed harvest, illness among workers, or a sudden storm, decisions had to be made quickly. The keeper's calm judgment became the fulcrum upon which survival rested. Even small errors in timing or allocation could lead to shortages, strained relations, or the failure of long-prepared plans. The ledger, precise and orderly, could not account for every variable, leaving the keeper to balance recorded certainty against unpredictable reality. In this constant negotiation between measurement and chance, the ledger keeper developed a quiet resilience. He learned to anticipate problems before they emerged, to notice subtleties others overlooked, and to act decisively while remaining methodical. His patience was more than a personal trait. It was a survival tool, shaping the rhythm of village life across seasons. While other figures, noblemen, clerics, or traders, might dominate historical accounts, it was often these quiet, detail-focused individuals who preserved the continuity of everyday life. As the final winter approached, the granary and its records reflected the culmination of a year's vigilance. Each sack had been weighed, each measurement cross-checked, and each note meticulously filed. Outside, the village prepared for frost, relying entirely on the reserves that had been carefully tended. Families cooked meals from the measured provisions, children played in the snow, and elders reflected on the season's successes and failures. Few gave thought to the ledger keeper, yet their survival was inseparable from his work. When the keeper finally rested, closing the leather-bound ledger and extinguishing the oil lamp, he contemplated the fragility of his achievements. Everything depended on careful observation and steady discipline, yet nature remained unpredictable. A single leak, an overlooked sign of dampness, or the subtle shifts in grain weight could undo months of effort. The ledger's permanence was an illusion. Its accuracy required constant vigilance. In this reflection lies the enduring lesson of the medieval grain house. Survival depended on the quiet, precise work that often went unnoticed. Ordinary people, tending to ordinary duties with patience and attention, shaped the rhythms of life, ensured food security, and upheld social trust. The ledger keeper embodied this truth. He was not famous. He did not appear in chronicles or epic tales, but in his diligent measurements, careful records, and calm judgment, he safeguarded life itself. And yet, even as he closed the ledger, one final thought remained unresolved. No matter how exact the measurements, no matter how careful the vigilance, how much control could a single individual truly exert over the unpredictable cycles of nature? Could a ledger ever fully contain the uncertainty of a world governed by weather, pests, and human error? Or was it simply the attempt itself, the daily attention to detail, that made survival possible? You now enter the dimly lit chambers of a medieval apothecary, a world filled with scents, textures, and the muted colors of dried herbs. Unlike the grain houses or monasteries you have walked through, this story focuses on a place where knowledge, observation, and subtle skill shape life in ways almost invisible to the ordinary townspeople. Here, the apothecary worked as a quiet intermediary between illness and recovery, between superstition and empirical observation, and between the fragile human body and the unpredictable world around it. Medieval medicine was rarely precise by modern standards. Disease was understood through a mixture of classical texts, inherited folk remedies, religious beliefs, and practical experience. Yet within this uncertainty, apothecaries developed intricate systems to observe, record, and manipulate the natural world. Their shops were often small, tucked between larger market stalls, or hidden along narrow streets. Shelves lined with jars, vials, and small boxes carried substances from near and far: dried roots, powdered minerals, preserved flowers, animal fats and oils. Each ingredient had a story, a purpose, and a method for preparation. The apothecary's day began early, long before the market opened, and often extended into late evening, long after the bells in the nearby church had faded. He, or occasionally she, arranged and inspected each container, noting the freshness of herbs, the potency of powders, and the clarity of liquids. Some jars were labeled with Latin terms drawn from classical texts, others bore the mark of local wisdom passed from generation to generation. Accuracy was essential. A mislabeled jar could result in ineffective treatment, or worse. Observation was the foundation of the apothecary's skill. Each plant or mineral was carefully examined for texture, color, aroma, and moisture. Leaves might be crushed between fingers to release fragrance, roots cut to check for dryness or brittleness, powders sifted to remove impurities. Even small differences could indicate changes in quality that would influence the effectiveness of remedies. The apothecary learned through repetition and experience to discern subtleties invisible to the untrained eye. The shop also functioned as a laboratory of preparation. Tinctures, ointments, poultices, and infusions required a blend of precise timing, measured quantities, and patience. Roots were steeped in alcohol or water, oils gently heated, powders combined in specific ratios. Some remedies had to be left to macerate for days or weeks, while others were applied immediately. The process demanded focus, a careful rhythm, and an awareness of how materials changed over time. In this sense, the apothecary was not merely a dispenser of remedies, but a custodian of slow, deliberate processes, working in the interstices of nature and human need. Patients arrived in varying states of urgency, and the apothecary had to assess not only their physical condition, but also the context of their ailments. A fever could signal infection, inflammation, or a dietary imbalance. A persistent cough might indicate a simple cold or a more dangerous disease. Medieval medical theory often linked health to the balance of humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments were designed to restore equilibrium, whether through purgatives, emetics, or external applications. In addition to theoretical knowledge, the apothecary relied heavily on observation: the color of the tongue, the pulse of the wrist, the quality of a patient's skin or sweat. Some remedies were straightforward: a decoction of chamomile to calm a restless stomach, a poultice of comfrey to soothe a bruise, or honey to aid a wound's healing. Others were more complex and obscure: powders mixed with minerals and herbs to treat convulsions, oils infused with rare flowers to ease respiratory distress, or alcohol-based tinctures meant to purify blood. Each preparation required careful documentation. Quantities, ingredients, and instructions had to be recorded so that subsequent treatments could be reproduced or adjusted. This record-keeping was meticulous, forming a quiet archive of practical knowledge that rarely reached beyond the walls of the shop. Apothecaries were also involved in managing the flow of their materials. Herbs had to be sourced from local markets, wild foraging, or distant regions, each supply varying in quality and price. Seasonal variation influenced potency. Leaves gathered in spring might differ in chemical properties from those harvested in autumn. Some ingredients were rare, expensive, or perishable, requiring careful storage to prevent spoilage. The apothecary learned to anticipate these changes, maintaining a balance between supply, demand, and the unpredictable patterns of nature. Despite the importance of their work, apothecaries often faced suspicion. Patients came with expectations informed by folklore, religious practice, and fear. Remedies were sometimes questioned, particularly when they did not produce immediate results. Apothecaries had to navigate the delicate line between practical knowledge and public perception, providing reassurance while adhering to the constraints of their craft. Authority was earned not only through expertise but also through trust. A patient had to believe that the careful observations, recorded instructions, and prepared mixtures would truly provide relief. The social aspect of the apothecary's life was subtle but vital. People from surrounding areas brought not only ailments, but also advice, gossip, and folk remedies. The shop became a site of exchange, a place where information about disease, diet, and survival circulated. The apothecary absorbed this knowledge, testing it carefully, discarding some suggestions, adapting others. In doing so, the practitioner contributed to a body of community-based medical understanding that was dynamic and continually refined, even if unrecognized in the broader historical record. Many apothecaries also interacted with physicians, monks, and midwives, forming networks that extended knowledge across urban and rural areas. Physicians might prescribe treatments, and apothecaries would execute them. Midwives often relied on remedies prepared in the shop for birthing complications or postpartum care. This collaborative system, though informal, depended on meticulous record-keeping, observation, and careful preparation, an invisible web of responsibility that sustained life in the face of uncertainty. The apothecary's work demanded a balance of intellect, patience, and physical dexterity. Hands that measured powders had to remain steady, eyes that inspected herbs had to remain discerning, senses had to be attuned to subtle changes. The work was repetitive yet varied, solitary yet socially essential. It was a profession that demanded quiet endurance, a slow accumulation of expertise, and constant vigilance against error or contamination. And yet, for all the care invested in the apothecary's work, uncertainty was ever present. Remedies could fail, diseases could strike unexpectedly, and ingredients could spoil despite careful attention. Each day brought new challenges: a sudden epidemic, an unfamiliar illness, or the arrival of a rare plant requiring immediate processing. The apothecary had to respond calmly, using experience, observation, and judgment to navigate the unpredictable and preserve life wherever possible. As you leave this first section of the apothecary's world, consider the quiet gravity of the work. These chambers of dried herbs and carefully labeled bottles were not places of spectacle. They were laboratories of patient observation, quiet calculation, and subtle skill. Without the apothecary's meticulous attention, countless illnesses would have gone unchecked, and communities would have been less resilient. Yet their contributions were often invisible, their labor unsung, and their knowledge quietly tucked into leather-bound ledgers or oral instruction passed between trusted hands. Even so, a question lingers in a world where success was measured only by the survival of the patient. How did apothecaries reconcile the inevitability of failure with the weight of expectation? How much could knowledge, patience, and careful preparation truly counter the unpredictability of disease? Morning light filters through the small, shuttered windows of the apothecary's shop, casting faint patterns on the worn wooden shelves. Dust motes drift lazily through the beams, illuminated by the sun, as you enter a space that hums with quiet, disciplined labor. In this section, the work of the apothecary becomes more than preparation and record-keeping. It becomes trial, observation, and the navigation of uncertainty. The stakes, while rarely publicized, are immense. The survival, comfort, and even life of the community depend on his skill. The apothecary begins each day with a careful inspection. Jars are uncorked, powders sifted, and tinctures tested. Some remedies require repeated observation to ensure their efficacy. A simple herbal infusion may appear ready one day, yet subtle changes in color, aroma, or consistency can reveal slow degradation or contamination. This process demands a patience that few modern minds can fully appreciate. Unlike tools that can be reset or replaced, herbs respond unpredictably to environmental changes, and mistakes in judgment can carry consequences that ripple through households and villages alike. One day, a patient arrives with a persistent cough, worsening over several weeks. The apothecary examines him carefully: the color of the tongue, the warmth of the skin, the rhythm of the pulse. The cough could be simple congestion, yet he considers deeper causes: damp conditions in the home, a minor infection, or dietary imbalance. He selects a combination of herbs known to soothe irritation and improve respiration, but the remedy must be prepared with exact proportions, steeped for precise durations, and administered at correct intervals. Any deviation, even a few hours, can reduce efficacy or worsen the patient's condition. It is not only disease that challenges the apothecary, the environment itself is a constant adversary. Temperature, humidity and sunlight affect every dried root and powdered mineral. Some remedies require cool, dark storage, yet the very buildings that house the apothecary are constructed of wood, stone, or thatch. Subject to the subtle shifts of weather, on hot days, oils may separate, powders clump, and tinctures evaporate. During damp periods, molds can emerge, threatening the integrity of preparations. The apothecary constantly monitors these factors, noting slight variations in texture, smell, or appearance, adjusting storage and preparation techniques accordingly. The social aspect of the work is equally challenging. Patients arrive with stories, symptoms described through local dialects, and expectations shaped by folklore. Some remedies are demanded, their efficacy already assumed through hearsay. Others are rejected, treated with suspicion. The apothecary must balance authority with diplomacy, explaining instructions carefully, managing skepticism, and persuading patients to follow precise regimens. Miscommunication could render even the most carefully prepared medicine ineffective. There is also the challenge of rare or exotic ingredients. Trade routes bring powdered gems, dried roots, and oils from distant regions, sometimes months after harvest. The apothecary must assess the quality and authenticity of these imported substances. Was the herb dried correctly? Has the resin lost potency? These questions are critical, because the wrong preparation could harm the patient rather than heal. Verification often involves subtle observation, comparing color, weight, and texture with familiar standards, sometimes guided by classical texts whose authority is unquestioned, but whose descriptions can be vague or inconsistent. Apothecaries often worked alongside physicians, monks, and midwives, creating a network of shared knowledge. The physician might prescribe a regimen, the apothecary would prepare and dispense it, while midwives relied on herbal remedies for childbirth. Each participant contributed to a layered system of care, where experience, observation, and patience were as valuable as written instruction. Errors were rarely fatal on a single occasion, but repeated misjudgments could erode trust, disrupt treatment, or result in serious harm. Occasionally, the apothecary faced crises that required immediate adaptation. An outbreak of fever in a small village demanded rapid preparation of remedies, careful rationing of scarce ingredients, and repeated observation of patients' responses. Even with precise measurement, some treatments would fail, and others might work partially. In these moments, the apothecary learned to improvise, combining knowledge drawn from multiple sources, testing remedies incrementally, and observing subtle changes in symptoms. Success depended not on certainty, but on careful adjustment, patience, and careful documentation. Record-keeping remained central to this process. Every preparation, observation, and adjustment was noted in the apothecary's ledger. These notes were more than reminders. They formed a cumulative record of practical knowledge. Over time, they could guide future treatments, warn of repeated failures, or suggest new methods for similar conditions. The ledger was simultaneously a diary, a recipe book, and a repository of observation, capturing the slow accumulation of expertise that defined the apothecary's role. Yet, despite all these efforts, failure was inevitable. A patient could succumb to illness, despite careful attention, or a remedy could prove ineffective against a new strain of disease. Ingredients might spoil before they could be used. Weather could alter harvests, changing the chemical properties of essential herbs. The apothecary's work was a constant negotiation with uncertainty, a delicate balance between careful preparation and the unpredictability of the world. The apothecary's role extended beyond the shop. He advised families on diets, sanitation, and seasonal precautions. He instructed apprentices who might later take over the work, ensuring that knowledge was preserved and adapted. These responsibilities demanded long hours, careful attention, and an unwavering commitment to observation. Even minor misjudgments could affect multiple households, highlighting the quiet but critical power of this work. In observing the apothecary, one notices the blend of patience, skill, and humility required. The work was slow, repetitive, and meticulous, yet its impact was profound. Each careful measurement, each repeated observation, each note in the ledger contributed to the survival and resilience of a community that depended on his skill. While physicians might command attention with grand theories or dramatic interventions, it was the apothecary's persistent, almost invisible labor that ensured the continuity of life in subtle, unheralded ways. Even as you step back from the shop, consider the fragile balance that defined this world. Success depended on exactitude, observation, and adaptation, yet uncertainty was never fully eliminated. The apothecary could only manage probability, interpret signs, and guide treatment with careful judgment. The outcomes of his work were contingent, influenced by nature, materials, and human compliance. And so, you are left with a lingering question, as Section 2 closes, in a profession so dependent on observation, patience, and accumulated experience. What happens when nature or circumstance exceeds the limits of knowledge? How did apothecaries cope with the realization that some outcomes could never be controlled, no matter how diligent or skilled their attention? Evening falls over the narrow streets and crowded market squares of the medieval town. But inside the apothecary's shop, the air is still alive with the faint aroma of dried herbs, infused oils, and powdered minerals. This final section examines the culmination of the apothecary's work, the moments when preparation, observation, and skill meet the ultimate uncertainty of human health, and reflects on the quiet impact of this overlooked profession. The day begins with familiar rituals, inspecting jars, verifying tinctures, and dusting the shelves. Yet each morning carries with it the weight of unpredictability. An unexpected fever may appear overnight, a shipment of imported herbs may be delayed, or a new strain of illness may arrive from distant regions. The apothecary's skill lies not only in preparation, but in the ability to adapt, to recognize the nuances of each patient and each substance, and to adjust treatments based on both observation and precedent. Each decision is made against the backdrop of incomplete information. On one particular day, a young woman arrives with symptoms that have defied earlier remedies. Her skin is pale, her pulse irregular, and her breathing shallow. Previous treatments have provided only partial relief. The apothecary examines her carefully, consulting the ledger to review prior interventions, noting the timing, dosages, and materials used. Drawing from this accumulated knowledge, he selects a new combination of herbs, oils, and powders. Carefully measuring each quantity, he instructs her family on precise administration, the frequency, timing, and method of application. Every step is deliberate, every detail recorded, every precaution taken. Yet even such meticulous care cannot guarantee success. Medicine in the medieval period is a negotiation with uncertainty. Illness is not always observable in ways that reveal a clear path to cure, and remedies often work partially or inconsistently. The apothecary's role is therefore as much interpretive as it is practical. He must read subtle signs, coloration, texture, taste, and patient response to gauge efficacy. He must monitor changes over days and weeks, adjusting remedies in response to observed effects. In doing so, he transforms raw materials into living knowledge, blending empirical observation with inherited wisdom. The shop itself becomes a stage for patient observation. The apothecary notes the reactions of herbs when infused in water or oil, observes the stability of powders when exposed to air, and considers the effects of seasonal changes on potency. Herbs harvested at different times of the year exhibit subtle differences. Minerals vary depending on source. Animal-derived compounds respond unpredictably to heat and moisture. These factors, imperceptible to the untrained eye, influence the outcome of treatments and demand constant attention. Interpersonal skill is equally vital. Families rely on guidance as much as on remedies, and compliance with instructions can determine success or failure. The apothecary provides careful instruction, demonstrates preparation methods, and adjusts for local conditions such as water quality or dietary habits. His role extends beyond dispensing remedies. He becomes a teacher, observer, and interpreter of a complex, often inconsistent natural and human environment. Despite all precautions, failure is inevitable. Some patients do not recover. Some treatments have unintended consequences. Some remedies prove ineffective against illnesses that are not yet understood. For the apothecary, this uncertainty is a constant companion, shaping the rhythm of his work and the tone of his daily life. Yet it is also a source of insight. Each failure contributes to knowledge: what works under certain conditions, what does not, and what requires further observation. Even setbacks are recorded in the ledger, contributing to the slow accumulation of expertise over time. Beyond immediate care, the apothecary's work shapes broader social and medical practice. Apprentices learn through observation, absorbing both technical skill and patient judgment. Records preserved in ledgers form a repository of local knowledge, guiding treatments for generations. His meticulous practice fosters trust within the community, stabilizing households and villages that rely on consistent access to remedies, especially during epidemics or harsh seasons. Though he rarely achieves public recognition, his impact is profound. As night deepens, the apothecary prepares for rest, reviewing the day's observations one final time. The shop, filled with jars and bottles reflecting candlelight, is a quiet testament to centuries of careful labor. Each item, each preparation, represents patience, observation, and skill applied to the fragile task of preserving life. The work is unglamorous, repetitive, and slow, yet it is indispensable. Life continues not through spectacle, but through these persistent, unrecorded acts of attention and care. The enduring lesson of the apothecary's labor is both simple and profound. Knowledge alone cannot overcome uncertainty, yet it shapes human experience, mitigates risk, and provides a structure within which life can persist. The apothecary demonstrates the subtle power of observation, patience, and meticulous attention to detail in a world governed by unpredictable forces. As the final hours pass, you are left with one lingering reflection. Even when armed with careful records, extensive observation, and centuries of accumulated practice, how much control does one individual truly have over the living, unpredictable bodies they care for? Perhaps it is not absolute control that defines success, but the persistent, patient effort to reduce uncertainty, one measured step at a time. You now turn your attention to the work of another unsung group of medieval specialists, the bridge builders. Unlike the apothecaries tending to human ailments or the ledger keepers ensuring sustenance, these men, and occasionally women, worked on a scale both imposing and invisible, shaping the landscape itself. Their craft demanded patience, precision, and a quiet understanding of forces that few outside their profession could perceive. While bridges might appear as simple crossings over rivers and streams, they were the product of careful planning, long labor, and a deep comprehension of materials and natural dynamics. Medieval Europe relied heavily on river transport, overland carts and foot traffic for commerce and communication. Rivers, while vital for trade, also posed barriers. Crossing them required ingenuity. Temporary fords might suffice in summer, and ferries in calmer stretches, but for growing towns, monasteries, and trade routes, permanent bridges were essential. These structures, however, were far from simple. They had to endure seasonal floods, shifting currents, frost and decay, while supporting the weight of carts, horses, and pedestrians. Each stone, timber, and joint mattered, and every builder understood that failure could have catastrophic consequences. The work began long before a single stone was laid. Builders surveyed the river and its banks, noting the soil's firmness, the strength and depth of the current, and the potential for erosion. Wooden stakes marked the intended course, and small sketches, often etched on parchment or prepared in chalk, guided the team. Medieval engineering relied on observation and practical experience more than formal mathematics, though geometry and proportion were central to ensuring balance and stability. The master builder, usually a man of decades of experience, guided apprentices and laborers through the process with patience, teaching them to read the river as much as to read the plans. Foundations posed the first challenge. Stone piers or wooden piles had to be driven into beds that shifted unpredictably with the flow of water. This required tools such as pile drivers, hammers, chisels, and rudimentary cranes, all powered by human strength. Laborers worked in rotation, sometimes in freezing water, balancing on unstable scaffolds or narrow platforms. The master builder supervised each placement, checking angles, depths, and alignment. One misaligned pier could compromise the entire structure, a lesson learned in previous failures that still echoed in the profession. The choice of materials reflected both local availability and intended longevity. Timber was abundant and relatively easy to shape, but vulnerable to rot and flood damage. Stone was more durable, but required quarried supplies, often transported over long distances at significant effort and expense. Mortar, lime, and sometimes wooden pegs bound these materials together, each with its own set of limitations. Builders carefully considered the properties of each component, accounting for seasonal changes and the river's temperament. Mistakes could be hidden, slowly weakening the bridge until a flood revealed the failure. Scaffolding and temporary frameworks were essential. These structures allowed builders to reach higher arches and guide stones into precise positions. Timber beams, ropes, and pulleys created platforms that seemed precarious, yet were ingeniously balanced to distribute weight and withstand minor shifts. The work demanded coordination. One misstep, one misplaced rope, could endanger the laborers and compromise the structure. Master builders trained their teams to move in synchrony, to observe changes in pressure, and to adjust supports incrementally as construction progressed. The pace of building was deliberate. Unlike modern construction, which can rely on machinery and prefabricated materials, medieval bridge work relied entirely on human labor and simple tools. Each stone had to be shaped, hoisted, and positioned by hand, often guided by ropes and wooden jigs. Mortar had to cure, foundations had to settle, and scaffolds had to be adjusted continually. Days could pass with only a few feet of progress. Yet every effort was measured, every placement recorded in the minds of the builders, and occasionally on parchment or in sketches. Rivers themselves were unpredictable partners. Seasonal floods could wash away unfinished piers, carry off scaffolding, or destabilize newly placed stones. Builders learned to read subtle changes, water coloration, eddies, the angle of debris moving downstream. Such observations informed when work could safely continue, and when it had to pause. Sometimes, after a flood, the builders returned to realign the structure, repair damage, or reinforce foundations, recognizing that the river's patience was as crucial as their own diligence. Beyond technical skill, the bridge builders carried a form of social responsibility. Bridges were critical for trade, military movement, and daily life. A collapsed bridge could isolate villages, impede commerce, or even cause deaths. The builders' labor ensured continuity, safety, and connectivity in ways that few citizens consciously appreciated. Their work was largely invisible until failure or completion, yet it shaped the economy, travel, and communication of entire regions. Apprentices learned through observation and repetition, guided by master builders who emphasized both caution and creativity. They studied the behavior of wood under stress, the weight-bearing qualities of stone, and the interactions of materials in wet conditions. They learned to anticipate the slow settling of foundations, the gradual erosion of supports, and the subtle shifts caused by repeated foot traffic. The work demanded a blend of practical intuition, accumulated experience, and meticulous observation. As the sun sets over a partially completed bridge, scaffolding silhouettes against the fading light, you notice the quiet rhythm of labor, the measured swing of hammers, the careful placement of stones, the low murmur of instructions and corrections. Each day the builders adapt to the river, the weather, and the limits of their own endurance. Their work is slow, repetitive, and exacting, yet it is essential. Without their persistence, communities would remain disconnected, commerce would falter, and life along the river would be far more precarious. Even so, one question lingers as this first section closes. In a profession where success depends on both human skill and natural cooperation, how do builders reconcile the inevitability of unforeseen disasters? How much of the bridge's endurance rests on human ingenuity, and how much on the river's unpredictable temperament? The answer remains uncertain, waiting for observation, adaptation, and perhaps the next flood to reveal it. The morning light filters weakly through a mist hovering over the river. The partially constructed bridge stands half-dreamed, half-realized, a delicate lattice of stone, timber, and human effort. The laborers arrive quietly, their boots muddy from the riverbank, their hands stiff from the chill. Today, as on countless days before, the master builder oversees their work, eyes scanning the shifting currents and the placement of each timber. Every movement, every adjustment, carries weight far beyond the visible progress. Here, patience and persistence are as essential as skill. Foundations are tested continuously. Even after months of construction, the river can reveal hidden weaknesses. The master builder examines the submerged piers, noting subtle movements in the stone. He observes the way the current sweeps around newly set piles, listening to the murmur of water against stone, learning its rhythms. Timber scaffolding must be adjusted, supports reinforced, and sometimes entire sections dismantled and rebuilt. In these quiet, repetitive tasks lies the essence of survival, not just of the structure itself, but of the workers who depend on it for livelihood and security. The apprentices follow closely, learning to recognize patterns invisible to the untrained eye. They note how water wears away softer stone, how frost expands the smallest cracks, how different timbers bend under weight. One mistake, a misaligned support, a poorly set stone, can compromise the bridge, forcing laborers to redo hours of painstaking work. Yet repetition teaches observation, and observation builds intuition. Over time, these young learners internalize lessons that no textbook could provide. developing a silent understanding of forces both human and natural. Material choice continues to dictate the rhythm of work. Stone quarried from nearby hills must be shaped with chisels and hammers, each block carefully aligned. Timber must be seasoned and treated to resist rot and water damage. Mortar, mixed from lime and sand, needs time to cure, sometimes taking weeks for even a small section to set fully. Every step demands precision and timing, and the builders must coordinate their labor to ensure that no section is stressed before it can bear weight safely. The work is unglamorous, monotonous, and exhausting, yet its consequences ripple through the community for decades. Seasonal changes influence strategy as much as the river does. Spring thaws bring swollen currents capable of undermining even carefully set foundations, while summer droughts can leave piles exposed, drying and cracking the timber supports. The master builder records these observations in notes and sketches, documenting water levels, foundation shifts, and weather patterns. These records guide decisions for future construction and repairs, a slow accumulation of knowledge that transforms repetitive labor into expertise. Without such careful attention, the bridge's endurance would be a gamble rather than a certainty. Social and economic pressures add another layer of complexity. Towns and estates await the completion of the bridge for trade, travel, and taxation purposes. Delays can hinder commerce, isolate communities, and cause unrest. The builders work within these constraints, often negotiating with patrons or local authorities to manage expectations. They must balance the urgency of completion with the necessity of structural integrity. A hasty build can produce a landmark that collapses under pressure. Deliberate care ensures longevity, but tests the patience of the wider community. Safety, though rarely prioritized outside the construction crew, is an ever-present concern. Workers move along narrow beams, hoist heavy stones with ropes and pulleys, and wade into icy currents to secure supports. One slip could result in serious injury or death. Yet the master builder maintains an unspoken system of caution. Scaffolds are double-braced, ropes checked constantly, and labor divided to distribute risk. Apprentices learn the physical and mental discipline required to operate safely within this environment, a training that instills not just skill, but also respect for the river's power. Throughout these months, the builders develop a rhythm, a blend of observation, adjustment, and repetition. Work is slow, and progress is measured in inches or days rather than dramatic leaps. Yet, each increment matters: a stone correctly placed, a timber correctly cut, a mortar layer fully set. Cumulative effort is the bridge itself. No single action creates the structure, but each contributes to a greater whole. The process is both literal and symbolic. Patient labor, repeated observation, and methodical action transform chaos into stability. Even as they work, uncertainty never fully disappears. Seasonal floods could shift a foundation, strong winds might unbalance scaffolding, and unseen flaws in materials could compromise sections months or years later. The builders learn humility in the face of these forces. Mastery is partial, success is contingent, vigilance is perpetual. They reconcile the impermanence of their work with the knowledge that their careful effort increases the probability of longevity, even if ultimate control remains elusive. By evening, the river runs darker, reflecting the fading sky. The scaffolding creaks under its own weight. Stones are stacked in neat courses, and timber beams rest in place. The master builder surveys the day's progress, noting minor shifts in alignment, subtle cracks forming, and areas requiring reinforcement. He records these observations, passing the knowledge to apprentices who will continue the work. The bridge, still incomplete, stands as a testament to human patience, skill, and perseverance in the face of unpredictable natural forces. And yet, as Section 2 closes, a question remains unresolved. In a profession dictated by observation, repetition, and incremental adjustment, how much of the bridge's future depends on human diligence, and how much is surrendered to the whims of rivers, weather, and time? Could the builders ever truly anticipate all that nature might demand? Or was their greatest skill simply learning to endure uncertainty, day by day, stone by stone? The river flows quietly beneath the skeletal form of the bridge, winding its way through the valley as it has for centuries. On this third section, you witness the culmination of months or even years of meticulous work. The builders have endured frost, flood, fatigue, and the slow, relentless pressure of time itself. Their labor is almost invisible to the wider world, yet the bridge stands as a testament to their skill, patience, and resilience. The final stones are carefully placed, each one fitted to lock perfectly with its neighbor. Mortar is applied in measured quantities, compressed by steady hands, allowed to settle before any weight is applied. Timber supports are gradually removed, tested for strength, then replaced or reinforced where necessary. Apprentices observe every motion, internalizing lessons that no written text could convey: the subtle distribution of weight, the sound of stones settling into place, the invisible shifts in the scaffolding under wind and water. These observations, repeated day after day, form the living knowledge of the craft. Even after completion, the bridge is not immune to the forces that shaped its construction. Seasonal floods still test the piers. Frost continues to crack mortar and timber. Debris may scrape against foundations. Yet each challenge faced during construction has taught the builders how to anticipate problems, adjust materials, and strengthen vulnerable points. The bridge is a structure of cumulative human foresight, experience, and vigilance, a collaboration between human diligence and natural rhythms. The laborers themselves, often unrecorded in chronicles, embody resilience. They arrive before dawn and leave after dusk, moving stones, cutting timber, and balancing on narrow scaffolds above rushing water. Their movements are precise, learned through repetition and careful observation. They understand the limits of their bodies, the strength of their materials, and the patience required for mastery. In this quiet, repetitive practice lies a form of silent genius, the ability to work in harmony with forces both human and natural. The social importance of the bridge cannot be understated. Once completed, it facilitates trade, travel, communication, and military movement. Villages once isolated by rivers now connect. Markets expand, communities thrive. The bridge, though built by hands unseen and largely unrecorded, reshapes daily life, commerce, and even political influence. The impact of these builders extends far beyond the immediate labor site, rippling through the region in ways that the builders themselves may never fully witness. Yet, for all its durability, the bridge is not permanent. Time, weather, and human use will eventually wear it down. Mortar will crumble, stones will shift, and wood will rot. The river will continue its patient work, eroding foundations and challenging human designs. The bridge will need repair, reinforcement, and perhaps eventual reconstruction. The master builder understands this impermanence, knowing that their labor is both a triumph and a temporary negotiation with forces beyond control. There is a certain humility inherent in the builder's understanding of their craft. Success is measured not only by the immediate completion of the bridge, but by its endurance over seasons and generations. Mastery is partial. It is an ongoing dialogue with time, nature, and human use. The builders leave behind more than stone and timber. They leave knowledge, methods, and traditions that guide future generations in facing the same challenges. As the day draws to a close, and the sun dips low over the river, the bridge stands firm yet quietly vulnerable. Shadows lengthen across the arches, the water reflects the fading light, and the soft creak of timber settles into stillness. You realize that the value of the bridge lies not in grandeur or spectacle, but in its steady functional presence, a product of patient observation, repetition, and careful adaptation. In a world of uncertainty, this quiet persistence ensures connection, survival, and continuity. And yet, as you step back and reflect, one lingering thought remains. Even with centuries of accumulated knowledge, patient labor, and careful observation, how much of the bridge's fate lies in human hands, and how much remains surrendered to the enduring, unpredictable forces of nature? Perhaps the true mastery of the builders was not in controlling the river, but in learning to work alongside it, one stone, one beam, one measured action at a time.